She married a crime lord to save her brother's life. She never expected to fall in love with him. If you've made it this far, don't leave yet. This story will pull you under and not let go until the very last second. Hit that like button and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now settle in. This one's going to hurt before it gets better. The morning Elena Ashcroft signed her name on a marriage contract she hadn't written, she told herself it was just ink on paper. She was wrong. Some signatures don't mark a beginning. They mark the moment your old life stops breathing, and something far more dangerous takes its first breath in the dark. The call came at 2:47 in the morning. Elena was still at her drafting table, surrounded by the wreckage of a residential project she'd been fighting with for 6 weeks. Elevation studies taped crookedly to the wall, structural calculations written in the margins of takeout napkins, 3 cold cups of coffee she'd forgotten to drink. The lamp above the table threw a hard yellow cone of light over her hands, and her hands were shaking before she even picked up the phone. She saw Owen's name on the screen and answered without thinking. The voice on the other end wasn't her brother. It was a man she didn't recognize. His voice was low and clean, the way water sounds before it turns to ice. He told her that Owen Ashcroft had been taken into federal custody 2 hours ago on suspicion of embezzling $18 million from Kessler Vance Global Investments. He told her the arrest had been processed, that Owen had asked for no legal counsel yet, and that the evidence against him was, in his words, substantial. Elena said nothing for a moment. The pencil in her hand snapped. "Who is this?" she said. The man didn't answer that. He said, "There's something else, Ms. Ashcroft. Something the federal investigators don't know yet and won't know unless you choose to tell them. The money your brother is accused of taking, it wasn't Kessler Vance's, it was ours." She stood up. Her chair scraped back hard against the floor. "I want you to meet with us," the voice continued. "Tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock, I'll send a car." He read her home address back to her, each digit precise, unhurried. The way a man reads an address when he wants you to understand that finding it was the easiest thing he did all day. The call disconnected. Elena stood in the silence of her apartment for a long time. The lamp was still on. The drafting paper was still pinned to the wall. Everything looked exactly the same as it had 30 seconds ago, and absolutely nothing was. She dialed Owen's cell. It went to voicemail. She dialed it again. On the 4th try, she stopped and stood very still in the kitchen with her phone pressed flat against her sternum, feeling her own heartbeat like a fist knocking from the inside. Owen was 26 years old. He'd graduated top of his finance cohort at Hereford University, had taken the position at Kessler Vance 2 years ago, and had spent those 2 years calling Elena every Sunday to complain about his bosses and tell her about the Thai restaurant near his office that she had to try. He was the most honest person she knew. He was also, she understood now with cold and terrible clarity, the most trusting. She did not sleep that night. The car arrived at 8:50. It was black and unmarked, and the driver said nothing except to confirm her name when she came down from the building. The seats were leather. The windows were tinted to near opacity. Elena sat in the back with her hands in her lap and watched the city slide past behind the glass. Dunmore City in early morning, the financial district towers throwing long shadows across the pavement, commuters moving in dense rivers along the sidewalks, oblivious. She thought about what she knew about the Morelli name. Everyone knew something. In a city like Dunmore, the Morelli family was the kind of institution that existed in the gaps between what was legal and what was tolerated. A name attached to investment portfolios and real estate holdings that sat too clean on paper, to the kind of influence that made prosecutors hesitate and politicians remember prior engagements. She had heard the name the same way she'd heard rumors about storms forming far offshore, something you noted and filed away and hoped would never make landfall near anything you loved. The car stopped in front of a building in the Haverford district. Old stone facade, no signage, the kind of restrained architecture that communicated wealth by refusing to announce it. A man in a charcoal suit was waiting at the door. He didn't smile. He said, "Ms. Ashcroft," and held the door open, and she walked through it because standing on the sidewalk was not going to save her brother. She was taken through a lobby, up an elevator that required a key card, and into a corner office on the 14th floor that looked out over the city's western edge toward the harbor. The room was quiet in a deliberate way, soundproofed, she suspected, though there was nothing clinical about it. Bookshelves, a long conference table, a desk near the windows with nothing on it except a single closed folder. A man was standing at the window with his back to her. He turned when she walked in. She had built a mental image of him in the car, something composite, assembled from every piece of mob mythology she'd absorbed without meaning to. She was not prepared for the reality. Lucien Morelli was somewhere in his mid-30s, dark-haired, with the kind of face that looked like it had been carved by someone who admired precision. There was nothing theatrical about him. No rings, no obvious displays. He wore a dark suit with no tie, and he looked at her the way a man looks at a problem he has already begun to solve. "Miss Ashcroft," he said. "Sit down." "I'd rather stand." He studied her for a moment. Something in his expression shifted slightly. Not quite surprise, not quite appreciation. He moved to one side of the conference table, and she remained where she was, near the door, and for a moment neither of them spoke. "Your brother has been set up," Lucien said. "I know that." "Do you know by whom?" She didn't answer. She didn't know, and the not knowing was a splinter under her skin. The documents used to frame him were embedded inside Kessler Vance's internal transfer system by someone with executive-level access, Lucien said. He was not reading from anything. He spoke the way people speak when information is architecture, already built, load-bearing. Owen approved a series of fund transfers over a 6-week period. He believed they were routine cross-border liquidity adjustments. He had no reason to question them. The authorizations were forged using a digital signature replication technique that required both inside access and external programming resources. Elena felt the room tilt slightly and steadied herself. "If you know all of that, why isn't it already in front of the federal investigators?" "Because releasing it now would compromise an ongoing investigation into how those funds moved after they left Kessler Vance." He paused. "Into how they ended up in accounts that our organization has been tracking for 8 months. "That's not my problem," Elena said. "My problem is that my brother is sitting in a federal holding facility right now, and you're telling me you have information that could clear him and you're choosing not to use it." "Not choosing not to use it," Lucien said. "Choosing the correct moment." She stared at him. "That's not a distinction I find comforting." "It isn't meant to comfort you." He moved to the desk. He opened the folder. He slid it across the table toward her, far enough that she would have to walk forward to read it. She walked forward. She looked down. It was a marriage contract. The paper was heavy, formal, printed with the kind of dense legal language that filled space while leaving the essential thing nakedly visible. Elena Meredith Ashcroft and Lucien Emilio Morelli, a legal union of record, terms of duration and dissolution attached as appendix. She looked up at him. "You're not serious," she said. "I am entirely serious." "This is—" She stopped. Her voice had done something she hadn't authorized. She pressed her lips together and started again. "You're asking me to marry you to keep my brother alive. I'm offering you a contract that protects your brother from both the federal case and from other interested parties who believe he stole from them. In exchange, you become my wife for a period not less than 12 months, during which time you'll reside in this building, attend public functions when requested, and maintain the appearance of a genuine union. And if I say no?" The silence that followed was not theatrical. It was simply accurate. "The federal case against Owen has enough manufactured evidence to send him away for 11 to 15 years, Lucien and said. "There are also individuals with less patience than federal prosecutors who believe the money Owen approved is money that was taken from them. I cannot extend protection to a man who has no formal tie to this organization. If you decline, Owen Ashcroft becomes a liability to people I can no longer intercede with." Elena turned away from him. She walked to the window. The city sat there below her, sprawling and indifferent, and she looked at it without seeing any of it. She was 31 years old. She had spent the last decade of her life doing exactly this, standing at windows in buildings she hadn't chosen, in situations she hadn't engineered, making decisions that cost her something so that Owen didn't have to pay the price. When their parents died 12 years ago, car accident on a rain-slicked highway outside Harwick, a night she still could not fully access without her chest locking up, Elena had been 19 and Owen had been 14, and she had dropped out of her first year of architecture school to work 3 jobs while fighting a probate court to keep them together. She had gone back to school 2 years later, part-time, and graduated at 26, while Owen sat in the front row in a borrowed blazer and cried, which had made her cry too, which was the only time she remembered crying in public. She had not built the life she had so that Owen could be destroyed by it. "I want his release from federal custody before I sign anything," she said, still facing the window. "That takes time. 48 hours, minimum." "Then you have 48 hours. And you'll sign." She turned around. He was watching her from across the room with that same unreadable expression, and she held his gaze and felt something she couldn't name exactly. Not fear, though fear was present. Something more like the sensation of stepping off a ledge and not yet knowing if the fall was survivable. "I'll sign," she said. Owen was released from federal custody the following afternoon. He called her the moment they returned his phone. She was sitting in the back of the same black car, being driven back to her apartment to pack what she'd need, and she answered on the first ring and listened to his voice, confused, frightened, thin with something that wasn't quite relief yet, and said, "I know, I'm handling it. Don't talk to anyone. Don't go to your apartment. Go to Marcus's place, and don't tell me where that is. Elena, what's happening? What? I need you to trust me right now and ask questions later." A long silence. Then, "Did you do something?" "I made an agreement. You're safe. That's what matters." She could hear him breathing on the other end. "Elena." "Don't," she said. Not harshly, just finally, like a door she needed to close. "Go to Marcus's. I'll call you when I can." She ended the call and sat in the moving car and did not let herself feel anything for exactly 3 minutes, because 3 minutes was all she could afford. She moved into the building on a Thursday. The suite they gave her was on the 12th floor. 3 rooms, high ceilings, windows that looked north over the rooftops toward the river. It was not what she would have chosen for herself. It was nicer than anything she'd lived in and felt less like hers than a hotel room. She unpacked one bag and left the other unopened and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the walls, which were very white and very clean and said nothing to her at all. Lucien did not come to see her that first day, or the second. She saw him on the 3rd day, in the common corridor between their respective suites. Apparently the organization's security requirements placed his rooms adjacent to hers, and they passed each other in the hallway with the stilted courtesy of strangers sharing a building elevator. He said good morning. She said good morning. He continued down the hall. She watched him for a moment before she stopped watching and went inside. She called her firm's project manager that afternoon and told her there had been a family emergency and she'd be working remotely for the foreseeable future. She sent her elevation revisions by email. She had a video call with her structural consultant. She did the things that looked, from the outside, like a person continuing to function. Inside, she was doing something else. She was measuring the room, the weight of it, the distance between the person she had been 72 hours ago and whatever she was now. On the 5th day, one of Lucien's people, a compact woman named Petra, with the posture of someone who had once been military and hadn't quite stopped, informed Elena that she would be attending a dinner the following evening. Private function, 12 guests, real estate, and finance. Petra handed her address hanging in a garment bag and said the car would leave at 7 and left without asking if Elena had questions. Elena unzipped the garment bag. The dress was black, floor-length, expensive in the way that didn't announce itself. She hung it on the back of the door and stared at it for a while. She thought about what Lucien had said during their first meeting. Attend public functions when requested. She had agreed to this. She had signed her name to it in a room with city views and a man who looked at her like she was a variable he was already accounting for. She wore the dress. The dinner was in a private room at a restaurant called Holloway on the city's east side. Dark wood, low light, the kind of place where the candles were real and the conversations weren't. Lucien was already there when she arrived, standing with a glass of something clear and talking to a man in his 60s who laughed at something and then looked at Elena as she approached and immediately stopped laughing. Lucien introduced her as his wife. The word arrived in the air between them like a stone dropped in still water, and she felt the ripple of it even as she extended her hand and smiled and said something she immediately forgot. He was different in the room than he was in his office. In the office, he'd been contained, deliberate, the specific stillness of someone who had learned that control communicated more than volume. Here, he moved differently. Not looser exactly, but inhabited the way a person moves in territory they understand. He introduced her to people whose names she filed away automatically, a professional habit, and he stood at an angle to her that was close enough to read as a couple and far enough that she never felt crowded. At one point, late in the evening, she said something about the restaurant's ceiling, a coffered plaster design that was either original to the 1930s building or a very good reproduction, and he turned and looked up at it and said, "Original. The owner spent 4 months fighting a renovation contractor who wanted to drywall over it." She looked at him. "You know the building's history?" "The owner told me." I asked. "Why?" He considered the ceiling again. "Because things that survive deserve to be acknowledged." She had no answer for that. She looked away first. On the ride back, they sat in separate corners of the back seat with the city going by outside both windows, and neither of them spoke. And Elena turned her face toward the glass and thought about survival, and what it cost, and what it changed in a person, and couldn't finish the thought because the car had stopped. She found the first piece of evidence on a Tuesday, 11 days into the marriage. She had been using one of the building's conference rooms to spread out her drafting work. Her apartment wasn't configured for large-scale layouts, and Lucien had told her, through Petra, that she was free to use any of the common workspaces outside business hours. She worked late, which she always had, and the floor was quiet by 8, and it was quiet that Tuesday when she heard raised voices coming from down the hall. She wasn't trying to listen. She tried for about 4 seconds, not to. Then she moved to the doorway. The voices were in a room 2 doors down. Not the conversation itself, but its shape, the cadence of anger being managed. Then a door opened and 2 men in suits walked past without looking at her. And then it was quiet again except for the sound of another door closing further down the hall. She went back to her drafting. But on the table when she returned, someone had left a folder that hadn't been there before. She would have noticed it. She was precise about her workspace in the way that people are precise when precision is how they think. The folder was thin and manila and had no label. She opened it. Inside were financial documents, specifically transfer records, Kessler-Vance routing numbers, external account identifiers, timestamps. She recognized the structure from the documentation Lucien had shown her in their first meeting, but these were different pages. On the 3rd page, highlighted in a color that looked like it had been done hastily, was an account number, and beneath it, a name. The name was not one she recognized, but the address attached to it was a building in the Carver Heights neighborhood, 3 blocks from the apartment where Graham Mercer, her former fiancé, had lived until, as far as she'd known, 6 months ago, when they'd ended things. She stood at the conference table for a long time with the folder in her hands. The building hummed around her with the low white noise of climate control. The city pressed against the windows, dark and indifferent. Graham. She turned the name over in her mind, examined it, looked for the angle. Graham Mercer was a financial consultant, mid-level, charming, the kind of man who collected connections the way other men collected watches. They dated for 14 months. She had liked him genuinely, or believed she had. She had ended things because he'd become evasive in ways she couldn't explain and eventually stopped trying to. She thought about Owen, sitting in a federal holding cell. She thought about the forged authorizations, the planted evidence, the executive-level access required to build the frame. She thought about the address on the document, 3 blocks. She closed the folder. She set it back down exactly where she'd found it. She went back to her drafting table and sat down and didn't touch her pencil for a long time. Then she picked up the pencil and started writing. Not architectural notation, a list, questions, what she knew, what she needed to know, what she was beginning to suspect. She was still writing when Lucien appeared in the doorway at 10:45. He looked at her. He looked at the folder, still sitting at the edge of the table. He said nothing. "You left that for me," Elena said. He leaned against the doorframe. "Did I? That's not a denial." "No," he agreed. "It isn't." She set down the pencil. "Why?" He was quiet for a moment. Because you're not someone who does well being managed, he said. You're someone who does well when they have information. She looked at him across the conference table, the width of it between them, the city behind him through the window, and the folder sitting there like a loaded question. She felt the strangeness of this arrangement pull at her like a current, the sense that the ground beneath the terms she thought she'd agreed to was shifting, rearranging itself into something she hadn't mapped yet. The name on that account, she said, Carver Heights. We're looking into it. I want to be part of that. His expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes did. A micro-adjustment, the kind that in another person might have been surprise. That's not part of the agreement, he said. The agreement, Elena said, is apparently more flexible than the original paperwork suggested. She held his gaze. My brother was framed. If you know who did it, I want to know. If I can help you get there faster, you should want that too. The silence stretched. Then Lucian straightened from the doorframe. Get some sleep, he said. We'll talk in the morning. He left. She listened to his footsteps diminish down the hallway and disappear. The building hummed. The city pressed its dark face against the glass. Elena looked down at her list of questions. She circled the name she'd written, Graham, and underneath it wrote a second name she hadn't spoken aloud yet, following a thread that had no right to make the sense it was making. Who benefits if Lucian falls? She stared at what she'd written. Her heart was going fast and steady and cold, the way it did when she was reading blueprints that didn't add up. When the structural math failed and the weight distribution was wrong, and the building, beautiful as it looked on paper, would not stand. Something was wrong with the architecture of all of this, and she was only just beginning to see where the walls had been moved. She was woken at 4:15 that same morning by the sound of her window shattering. The glass didn't implode the way glass does in falling accidents. It fractured in a specific directed pattern, a large triangular section blowing inward and scattering across the floor. Elena was off the bed before she was fully awake, moving on pure physical instinct, hitting the floor and pressing against the side of the bed frame. 2 seconds of silence. Then the door to her suite crashed open and 2 of Lucien's security team were inside. She recognized the larger one, a man named Dwyer, who moved through the room with a flashlight in one hand and something considerably more serious in the other. And in the corridor outside, she could hear voices, radio chatter, footsteps running. Dwyer swept the room and turned the flashlight beam toward the broken window. The jagged section of glass lay on the floor. In the center of what remained of the pane was a clean, precise hole. Not vandalism, not accident. A round. Elena sat on the floor beside her bed with her knees pulled to her chest, breathing carefully, feeling the adrenaline work its way through her system like a chemical tide. She was not, strictly speaking, frightened. She was something worse than frightened. She was furious in the particular way of someone who has just understood that the danger is not abstract. The second security operative, a woman Elena hadn't been formally introduced to, crouched next to her. Are you hit? No. You need to move to the interior corridor now. Can you stand? Yes, Elena said. She stood. Her legs worked fine. She followed the woman into the corridor without looking back at the window. Lucian was in the corridor. He was in a dark shirt, no jacket, the kind of underdress that meant he hadn't been asleep. He looked at her with an expression that was, briefly, before he controlled it, something far more raw than the careful neutrality she'd come to expect from him. His jaw was tight. His hands at his sides were absolutely still, in the way that only happened when a person was working very hard to keep them that way. You're not hurt, he said. Not a question. No. He looked at her for a moment that lasted slightly longer than functionally necessary. Then he turned to Dwyer. I want the surrounding roof access reviewed, and I want footage pulled from every camera in a 4-block radius. And I want to know who knew she was in that room tonight. Dwyer moved. Lucian turned back to Elena. Come with me. She followed him down the corridor, thinking about the hole in her window, the precision of it, and something he'd said to her only hours ago in the conference room. You're not someone who does well being managed. No, she thought, she wasn't. But someone out there had just made the second mistake they were going to make with her, The first had been assuming that marrying her into this world would make her a pawn. The second was missing. They put her in a room without windows. It was on the 10th floor, interior facing, the kind of space that existed in large buildings for exactly this purpose. No exposure, no angles, no line of sight from anything outside. A couch, a low table, a lamp in the corner throwing amber light across a rug that probably cost more than Elena's first car. Lucian's people called it a safe room. Elena called it what it was, a box. She sat on the edge of the couch and did not lie down. She was not going to lie down. Lying down meant admitting that her body needed something from this situation, and her body was not getting a vote right now. Dwyer had posted someone outside the door. She could hear the faint shift of weight in the corridor every few minutes. Whoever it was, they move the way people move when they're trying not to be heard and are very good at almost succeeding. Elena listened to those small sounds and breathed and thought. Someone had fired at her window. At 4 in the morning, from a position close enough and elevated enough to clear the building's security perimeter. Whoever it was had known which window was hers, had known she would be there, had chosen a time when the building's overnight staffing would be reduced. This was not random. This was not a warning. A warning doesn't aim for the glass directly above where a person is sleeping. This was an attempt that had failed because of angle or movement or some fraction of variance that Elena did not want to spend time calculating, because calculating it meant inhabiting the version of the night where it hadn't missed. She pressed the heels of her hands against her knees and breathed out slowly. Lucian came back at 5:20. He came in without knocking, which she was beginning to understand was simply how he moved through spaces, as if the rooms had already agreed to admit him. He was carrying 2 cups of coffee, which surprised her enough that she didn't say anything for a moment. He set one on the table in front of her and kept the other and stood near the lamp. "You should sleep," he said. "You said that 3 hours ago." "You didn't then either." She looked at the coffee. It was black. She picked it up and drank, and it was good, which she resented slightly because it made the whole situation fractionally more bearable than she wanted it to be. "What did you find?" she said. He lowered himself into the chair across from her. He held his cup with both hands and looked at her with the particular quality of attention she was starting to recognize. The kind that wasn't warm exactly, but wasn't cold either. The kind that meant he was choosing what to say instead of just saying it. The shot came from the Aldrin building, rooftop access. The lock on the stairwell door was bypassed cleanly. Not forced, bypassed. Professional equipment. Hired. Almost certainly. By who? He looked at her steadily. "We're working on that." "That's not an answer." "No," he said. "It's what I have right now." She set down the coffee and crossed her arms over her chest and looked at him, really looked at him, the way she'd been avoiding doing in any sustained way, because sustained looking at Lucian Morelli had a tendency to complicate things she needed to keep uncomplicated. He looked tired, not physically. His posture was unchanged, his hands were steady, but somewhere behind his eyes there was something compressed and working, something that looked, if she was reading it correctly, very much like controlled anger. "Who knows I'm here," she said. "In this building, not as your wife on paper, here, physically, residing. A contained number of people. How contained? Contained enough that tonight is a problem." The word landed between them with weight. Elena let it sit there. "You think someone inside told them?" "I think it's a possibility I'm not excluding." "That's a careful way to say yes." His jaw moved slightly. "It's an accurate way to say I don't yet have confirmation." She studied him. "Does it bother you? The idea that someone in your organization—" "Yes," he said. Flat, immediate, no performance in it. The single syllable of a man who had answered before he'd decided to. He looked down at his coffee for a moment, and when he looked back up, the compression behind his eyes had been redistributed, filed away, managed. "Get some sleep. Petra will be outside at 7. He stood. "Lucienne," she said. He stopped. She had used his name. She wasn't certain she'd done that before. Not directly, not in address. He seemed to register it the same way she did, a small recalibration in the space between them. "The folder you left me," she said. The account registered to the Carver Heights address. I need to know everything attached to that account. Not a summary. Everything. He stood for a moment at the edge of the lamplight. In the morning, he said. He left. Elena sat in the windowless room and listened to the building settle around her and did not sleep. The morning brought Petra, as promised, and also a man named Rice, who Elena hadn't encountered before. Mid-40s, glasses, the physical bearing of someone whose danger was entirely cerebral. He was introduced as a forensic financial analyst, and he shook her hand with the brisk efficiency of someone for whom social rituals were speed bumps. The three of them sat around the conference table on the 14th floor, and Rice opened a laptop, and Lucien stood near the window with his arms crossed, and for the next 2 hours Elena learned what had been done to her brother. The mechanism was elegant in a way that made her stomach turn. Owen had been given approval authority over a category of cross-border transfers in his second year at Kessler Vance. Standard for his seniority, standard enough that no one had questioned the assignment or its timing. Over 6 weeks, 43 transfer requests had been routed through Owen's approval queue. The requests had legitimate surface features, accurate routing formats, appropriate documentation, realistic transaction sizes. Owen had approved each one within 48 hours, same as he approved every legitimate transfer. The accounts receiving the funds did not belong to Kessler Vance clients. Whoever built the receiving end had shell company structures in 4 jurisdictions, Rice said, pointing at his screen with a stylus. Delaware, Cyprus, a Hong Kong entity, and a registration in the Isle of Man. Standard layering. The first movement out of each receiving account happened within 6 hours of the deposit, fast enough that a standard audit sweep wouldn't flag the originating transaction before the trail went cold. Elena looked at the screen. But someone was watching. Someone tracked the movement. We were tracking a separate set of accounts connected to a financial fraud case we've had under observation since last year, Lucien said from the window. The Kessler Vance transfers started landing in accounts adjacent to that network. That's when we identified the pattern. And Owen was already named in the transfers. His digital signature was on every approval. Whoever planted the architecture made certain of that. Elena looked at the account structures on Rice's screen. She thought about the time it would have taken to build this, the access required, the patience. This wasn't opportunism. This was months of construction, the kind of plan that required knowing Owen's role and clearance level well in advance, knowing who he was, where he worked, what he touched. Someone had watched her brother for a long time before they moved. The Carver Heights account, she said, the one in the folder. Rice pulled up a new tab. That account is registered to a shell entity called Greenvale Advisory Partners. The registration is 7 months old. The address is a mail drop, but the beneficial owner listed in the original filing, before it was amended 3 weeks after registration, was a man named G. Mercer. The room was quiet. Elena kept her face still. It was not easy. G. Mercer, she said. Graham Mercer, financial consultant. He amended the filing and substituted a nominee director, which is legal but tends to indicate the original disclosure was a mistake. Rice looked at her over his glasses. He's known to you? He was my fiancé, she said. Briefly, it ended about 8 months ago. Nobody said anything for a moment. She could feel Lucien's attention shift in the way a room's temperature shifts. Not dramatically, just enough to notice if you were already cold. 8 months ago, Lucien said. Yes. And the account was registered 7 months ago. I can do the arithmetic, she said. Her voice came out very even, which cost her something. She looked at the account registration date again, then at the first Kessler Vance transfer date, then at the date Graham had started pulling back from her. The evasiveness, the canceled dinners, the growing sense that he was somewhere else even when he was in the room. She had interpreted it as the slow deterioration of someone who was no longer interested. She had been generous in that interpretation. He knew Owen worked at Kessler Vance, she said. Not a question. Yes, Rice said. We believe so. He used to ask about Owen's work, at dinners. I thought he was just... She stopped. She had thought he was just making conversation, being interested, because that was what you thought about the person you were building a life with, until you understood that the interest had always been inventory. He was scoping the access point the whole time. The silence in the room had a texture to it now, the specific density of people who already know something and are watching the last person in the room arrive at it. She looked up at Lucien. "What else do you know about him?" Lucien was watching her with the expression she'd seen on the roof access corridor the previous night. That briefly unguarded thing, compressed back but not entirely gone. "More than I should tell you in one sitting," he said. "Tell me anyway." He was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded at Rice once, and Rice opened a third tab, and the screen showed a network diagram. Names and nodes, lines connecting them. A visual map of association and transaction that extended outward from Graham Mercer's name in two distinct directions. One branch pointed toward the Kessler-Vance transfers. The other pointed toward a cluster of entities Elena didn't recognize. But she recognized one name near the center of that second cluster. Danton Capital Group. She had heard it 3 weeks ago, at the dinner at Holloway, when one of the men Lucien had introduced her to had mentioned it in passing, and another man's expression had done something careful and contained before the conversation moved on. "Danton," she said. "Danton Capital is the primary investment vehicle for a network of business interests currently in competition with several of our holdings," Lucien said. "They've been trying to displace our position in 3 specific sectors for 2 years, legitimately thus far. Legal maneuvers, market positioning, some corporate intelligence operations that approach the line. And Graham is connected to them. We believe Graham works for them. The consulting business is a front, or more accurately, a secondary income stream. His primary function appears to be intelligence gathering and relationship cultivation." Elena looked at the network map, the lines between nodes, the neat, deliberate architecture of a plan she had lived inside without seeing its shape. "The whole engagement," she said. "Meeting me, dating me, all of it." "We don't know the full timeline yet," Lucien said. "But the structure suggests—" "Don't be careful with me," she said. The sharpness in her voice surprised even her. She caught it, steadied. "I don't need careful. I need accurate." He met her eyes. "The structure suggests you were targeted specifically. Because of Owen's position at Kessler-Vance, yes, but also because of your relationship with your brother, because they knew that if he was in danger, you would do anything to protect him." The sentence landed cleanly and didn't leave. Elena sat with it. She understood, in the way you understand things that rewrite history without your permission, that every moment she had attributed to chance or chemistry or the ordinary randomness of meeting someone had been a decision made in a room she was never in, by people she had never met, who had looked at her love for her brother and seen a mechanism. She breathed in carefully. She breathed out. "The shot last night," she said. Lucien nodded. Rice closed the laptop. "They want me dead before I understand the full picture," she said. "Before you can be useful to us," Lucien said, "and before you can testify." "Testify to what?" "To the fact that you were coerced into this marriage." He said it neutrally, the way he said most things, but there was something underneath the neutrality she couldn't quite excavate. A coerced spouse with first-hand knowledge of a conspiracy standing in front of a federal grand jury is the most damaging possible witness against the people behind this. She looked at him. "You've been thinking about this as a legal case from the beginning." "I've been thinking about it as something that needs to end correctly," he said. She didn't entirely know what to do with that. She filed it. "What do you need from me?" she said. What he needed from her, it turned out, was the one thing nobody had thought to ask her to do in any of the weeks since this had started. Remember. She spent the afternoon in the conference room with Rice and a woman named Callahan from Lucien's legal team, going through 14 months of her relationship with Graham Mercer with the exhaustive, methodical granularity of an archaeological dig. Where they'd met, a charity event for an urban planning nonprofit, which felt obscene in retrospect, the deliberate appropriateness of it. How quickly he'd established regular contact. The questions he'd asked about her work, her family, Owen's job. The twice he'd suggested she introduce him to Owen, and the twice she'd declined because Owen was protective of his own relationships, and she hadn't wanted to push it. She was grateful, bitterly and viscerally, for that particular instinct. They documented everything. Dates, locations, specific questions she could recall him asking. Callahan took notes with the focused intensity of someone building a structure because that was exactly what they were doing, building a structure that could hold weight in front of a court. At 4:30, Lucienne appeared in the doorway and said to Callahan and Rice, "Give us the room." They gathered their materials and left. Elena stayed where she was. Lucien sat down across from her, not at the head of the table where he usually positioned himself, but across, the same way she'd first seen him in this room when the contract was between them and she hadn't yet known what any of this was going to cost. He looked at her directly. "There's one more thing," he said. She waited. "Danton's people believe you're already working for us, not as a wife, as an operative. They believe I recruited you specifically because of your connection to Kessler Vance through Owen." She absorbed this. "Do they? It's why the shot last night was aimed to kill rather than warn. To them, eliminating you eliminates both the intelligence risk and the legal exposure. They think I'm a spy." "Yes. And am I?" She said it without heat, just the exact question it was. He didn't flinch. "You are now someone with information they cannot afford to surface. Whether you were recruited or stumbled into it is a distinction they've stopped making. Because it doesn't matter to them. No, it doesn't." Elena looked at the window. Evening was coming in across the city, the light going honey-colored and long, buildings casting their shadows eastward. She thought about the last 8 months, the way she'd reconstructed the breakup with Graham in her memory, his growing distance, the relief she'd eventually felt when it was over, the clean and simple narrative of two people who hadn't worked out, how she'd carried that narrative forward without examining it, the way you don't examine foundations until something shifts. "He's going to come for Owen," she said. "If I'm the legal risk, Owen is the leverage." Lucien's expression didn't change, but his hands moved, a small adjustment of his right hand on the table surface. "Owen is currently in a location that only 3 people know. 2 of them are in this building. One is Marcus Chen, his friend, who has no documented connection to either Kessler Vance or anyone in Danton's network. That you know of." "That we know of," he agreed, and the directness of the acknowledgement was somehow worse than reassurance would have been. Elena looked down at her hands on the table. Her knuckles were tight. She made herself relax them. "I want a phone call with Owen tonight. I can arrange a secure line. I want to tell him what's happening. That's your choice." She looked up. "Is it? Everything else seems to have been someone else's choice." He held her gaze. "Some of it was. I understand if that's not sufficient." She studied him. The quality of the statement, the refusal to dress it up, to apologize or justify, was disorienting in a specific way. The way honesty is disorienting when you've been navigating a landscape of careful management. She had the unsettling and unwelcome sense that she was beginning to trust him, which was a problem she didn't have room for right now. "I want in on the investigation," she said. "Not briefings, in." "Elena, I know the architecture of what Graham built," she said. "I know his patterns, how he asks questions, what he needs people to feel, what levers he uses. That's information you cannot get from a financial diagram." She leaned forward slightly. "You said it yourself. You told me I do better with information than management. That goes both ways." He was quiet. The city outside the window had gone from honey to amber and was heading toward gray. "You understand the risk," he said. It was not a question. "Someone shot through my window last night," she said. "I understand the risk." He looked at her for a long moment, then, "All right." The secure call with Owen was at 9 that night, 22 minutes. She told him the essential shape of it, the conspiracy, Graham's involvement, the ongoing investigation, in the flattened, controlled tone of a person delivering information they cannot afford to make emotional. Owen was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "He used you to get to me." "Yes." "Elena." His voice cracked on her name in a way that was almost unbearable. "I'm sorry." "Don't," she said. Same word, same delivery as before. Not harsh, just the only thing she could say without the conversation going somewhere neither of them could afford. "None of this is yours. You were targeted because you were honest and careful and good at your job. That's not a thing you apologize for." Silence. "Are you safe?" he said. "Where you are? Are you actually safe?" She thought about the window, about Lucien in the corridor at 4 in the morning with his jaw tight and his hands still. "I'm working on it," she said. She ended the call and sat in the dark for a while and let herself feel the weight of what was true. That she was 22 days into a marriage she'd signed under duress, that someone wanted her dead, that the man she'd almost married had used her as a tool, and that the man she'd been afraid of was currently the only person standing between her family and complete destruction. She went to bed at midnight. She slept for 4 hours, which was better than she'd expected. The second attempt came 6 days later, and it was less precise. She was in a car, one of Lucien's fleet, with a driver she knew named Tomas, returning from a site visit she'd insisted on making to a project her firm needed her physical presence for. Petra had objected. Lucien had not exactly approved it, but had not forbidden it, which she was learning was a specific mode of his. He rarely told her no directly. He simply assembled conditions around things he considered inadvisable and let her decide. She had decided. They were 4 blocks from the building when a car ran a red light at the intersection ahead and stopped crosswise, blocking the lane. Tomas braked hard. Elena lurched forward, seatbelt catching. She heard Tomas say something under his breath, his hand already moving for the radio. Then the rear window exploded. Not from a shot, from something thrown. A device that hit the glass and detonated with a concussive bang that wasn't explosive in the lethal sense, but was designed to incapacitate, to disrupt, to create enough noise and shock and glass that whatever came next could happen in the confusion. Elena's ears were ringing. The car was filling with acrid smoke. Tomas was on the radio. Her door was pulled open from the outside. A man she didn't know had his hand on her arm and was pulling, and she planted her left foot against the doorframe and shoved back and drove her right elbow into the side of his face with the specific committed force of someone who had taken 3 months of self-defense classes the previous year after a project site in the Belmore district had started receiving threats, and who was discovering that muscle memory was real. The grip on her arm loosened. Tomas was out of the car. The blocking car's engine revved. There was shouting from somewhere to her left. More of Lucian's people. A follow vehicle she hadn't been told about, which she was going to have opinions about later but was grateful for now, were converging on the intersection. It was over in 90 seconds. The man who'd grabbed her was on the ground. The blocking car had fled, running another light going east. Elena was standing on the sidewalk with her ears still ringing and her heart rate at approximately twice its resting rate, and Petra was in front of her doing a rapid assessment that Elena allowed because objecting would have been performative. "I'm fine," Elena said. "You've got glass in your hair." "I'm fine." Petra's expression said several things it was professionally declining to say aloud. They were back in the building within 15 minutes. Lucian was on the 14th floor when they arrived, in the middle of something with rice and 2 people she didn't know. She could tell from the way the room shifted when she walked in that whatever they'd been discussing was serious and recent. He looked at her, his eyes moved over her. A quick inventory, checking. And whatever he found was enough to release something in his posture by a fraction. "Sit down," he said. "I don't need to sit down." "Elena." "I said I'm fine." She crossed to the conference table and pulled out a chair and sat down, which she told herself was her choice. "They're escalating. The first attempt was professional and patient. This one was faster and more exposed. They used a disruption device and a physical grab. That's street-level work, not the same team as the rooftop." Lucien looked at her for a moment. Then he pulled out the chair across from her and sat down, which he rarely did when other people were in the room. He usually stood, near windows, near the margins of spaces. The deliberateness of sitting struck her without her being able to explain why. "You're right," he said. 2 different operational teams. Whoever is running this used their primary asset first. When it failed, they called in a secondary crew. Which means they're getting anxious. Which means the timeline has moved up. She looked at him. "What timeline?" He glanced at Rice. Something passed between them. The compressed language of people who had worked together long enough to have a shorthand. Rice closed his laptop and stood and left the room. The other two followed without being asked. Lucien looked back at Elena. "We've identified the point of collection," he said. "The location where Danton's people are consolidating the financial evidence against Owen, the manufactured documentation, the original forged authorizations, everything that was used to build the federal case. It's being held in a single secure server environment as leverage, to be released or withheld depending on how this plays out." Elena went still. "If we can access that server, we can pull the documentation showing the files were forged. We can show the fabricated signature replication. We can hand it directly to the federal investigators, and the case against Owen collapses." "Where is it?" He was quiet for a moment. The quality of the silence told her she wasn't going to like the answer. "There's an event next Saturday," he said. "A charity gala. The Whitmore Foundation benefit. Black tie. 600 guests. Political and financial sector attendees. Danton's primary representative will be there. A man named Hargrove." He paused. "Graham Mercer will also be in attendance." She didn't move. "The server access is held on a device Hargrove carries personally," Lucien continued. "A portable drive, hardware encrypted, biometric locked. We cannot acquire it externally. The security is designed to destroy data on any unauthorized access attempt." He looked at her steadily. "We need proximity. We need someone who can operate in that environment without triggering attention." "Someone who looks like she belongs there," Elena said. "Someone who Graham Mercer will approach willingly," Lucien said. "Because he believes you're still unknowing. He believes this entire time you've been a pawn who hasn't figured out the board." The room was very quiet. Elena looked at the table surface, at the wood grain of it, the small imperfections in the finish. She thought about 14 months of dinners and careful questions, and the specific warmth Graham had deployed like a tool, the warmth she'd believed was real, had built plans around, had told Owen about on their Sunday calls in the easy voice of someone who thought they'd finally found solid ground. "He'll come to me," she said, "at the event. Because he'll think I'm confused, frightened, looking for something familiar. Yes. And while he's occupied with managing me, we take what we need." She looked up at Lucien. The lamp above the table threw its cone of light between them, and his face was in partial shadow, and she could see the steadiness in him, the absolute, complete steadiness of a man who was asking something enormous and knew it and was not going to dress it up. "If something goes wrong at that event," she said, "Owen is exposed. I'm exposed. Everything we've built here falls apart." "Yes," he said. "That's accurate." She studied him. "And you're asking me anyway." "I'm telling you the situation," he said. "You told me some of the choices should be yours. This one is." Elena sat with it, all of it. The ringing that had finally faded from her ears, the glass that Petra had pulled from her hair, the network diagram with Graham's name in its center and lines reaching outward like the architecture of a lie she had lived inside. Owen's voice on the secure line, "He used you to get to me." Lucien at 4 a.m. with his hands still and something briefly raw behind his eyes. The contract she'd signed and the version of her life she'd had before it, and the question of whether that version was something she could return to or whether she was already someone else entirely. She knew, sitting in this room, that there was no version of what came next that didn't require her to walk into that ballroom and face the man who had manufactured her life as a mechanism. There was no clean way out. There was no direction that didn't cost something. She had spent 12 years making impossible choices for her brother's sake. This one, at least, was hers to make for her own. "I'll do it," she said. Lucien looked at her for a long moment. Something in the steadiness shifted. Not much, not enough to name easily, but enough to see if you were looking. "You have a week," he said. "We'll walk you through everything." She nodded. She stood. She was at the door when he said, "Elena." She stopped but didn't turn. "What happened in the car today?" He paused. "You should know. The man who grabbed you. When Dwyer's team pulled the vehicle registration, it traced back through 2 shells to an account connected to Greenvale Advisory Partners. Graham's account. She absorbed this. "He tried to have you taken," Lucien said. "Not killed. Taken." She stood in the doorway with her back to the room and understood what that meant. That Graham didn't just want her removed, He wanted her in a position where she could be used, pressured, made to cooperate with whatever function he still believed she could serve, that he thought she was still manageable, still a piece on a board she didn't know she was playing on. She put her hand on the doorframe. The wood was solid under her palm. "Then he still thinks he can use me," she said. "Yes." She nodded once to herself, to the empty corridor in front of her. "Good," she said. "Let him think that." She walked out and the door swung shut behind her, and somewhere in the city, in an office or a car or a room she had never seen, Graham Mercer was almost certainly deciding his next move, running his calculations, adjusting his plan with the confidence of a man who had never once considered that the woman he'd chosen as a pawn had been watching the board the whole time. The week before the gala moved the way weeks move when every hour has weight. Slowly on the surface, fast underneath, the way a river looks calm from a bridge, while the current below is doing something else entirely. Lucy's team ran her through the event 3 times in a conference room that had been reconfigured to approximate the Whitmore Foundation's ballroom layout. Tables marked with tape on the floor, entry points diagrammed on a whiteboard, the route from the main reception to the private corridor where Hargrove's security detail typically positioned itself mapped out in blue marker. Elena walked it until she could do it without looking at her feet. She memorized the guest list, the seating arrangement, the names and faces of Danton Capital's known associates. She memorized Hargrove, 61, silver-haired, the public face of a network that had spent 2 years trying to dismantle Lucian's holdings through legal pressure, market manipulation, and apparently, when those proved insufficient, manufactured federal cases and hired guns. She memorized Graham. She didn't need to study his photograph. She already knew the way he moved through rooms. The easy confidence, the hand that always found the right shoulder, the smile calibrated for whoever was receiving it. She had spent 14 months reading that calibration as genuine. The memory of her own certainty was the most nauseating part. Callahan worked with her on what to say. Not scripts. Scripts broke under pressure, but objectives. What she needed Graham to believe. What she needed him to do. She needed him to think she was still in the dark about his role, still frightened and destabilized, still the woman who had walked into a marriage she didn't understand because she had no other choice. She needed him to feel safe enough to stay close. "What if he's already suspicious?" she asked Callahan on the 3rd day. "Then you're a woman who's been living under duress for 3 weeks and reached out to a familiar face," Callahan said. "That's not suspicious. That's predictable. It's what he'd expect. He'll want something from me." "Yes. Information about Lucien, the organization's structure, anything that could be used against us. And I give him nothing true, nothing verifiable, just enough to make him feel like the conversation is productive." Elena nodded. She understood the logic. She also understood that she was going to have to sit across a table from the man who had constructed the worst months of her brother's life and her own, and perform ignorance and perform vulnerability, and do it convincingly enough to fool someone who had already fooled her for over a year. She had a single quiet moment, alone in the conference room after Callahan had left, where she sat with the flat reality of that and let it settle. Not the anger. The anger was available anytime, she'd learned. A resource she could access on demand. Something else. The particular grief of discovering that a person you loved was a fiction built for a purpose, and that the love itself, genuine as it had been the mechanism all along. She sat with it for 4 minutes by the clock on the wall. Then she stood up and went back to work. The night before the gala, Lucian came to find her. She was on the building's 12th floor, in the small sitting room adjacent to her suite at the window, watching the city. Not thinking about anything in particular. Just watching, the way you watch water when your mind needs to move without direction. He knocked, which he didn't always do, and she said, "Come in." And he came in and stood in the middle of the room with his hands in his pockets. "You should sleep," he said. "You say that a lot." "You don't do it a lot." She almost smiled. Almost. "Is there something you needed to tell me?" He was quiet for a moment. He moved to the window and stood beside her, looking out at the same city. The glass was intact. They'd moved her to a different suite after the first shooting, one with windows that faced an interior courtyard rather than the street. The view was less. It was fine. The extraction team will be positioned in 3 locations, he said. The primary point is the service corridor adjacent to the East Ballroom. If at any point the situation moves out of range, you find that corridor. You don't wait for instructions. I know. Petra will be in the room. She'll be positioned near the bar on the north wall. You make eye contact every 15 minutes. I know all of this. I know you know it. He was quiet again. Outside, a light rain had started. She could see it in the halos around the streetlights, the way the reflections on the pavement below fractured and multiplied. I want to say something that isn't operational. She turned to look at him. He was looking at the window, his profile against the glass, and the rain outside was doing something to the light that made everything look slightly more exposed than usual. What happened to your brother? He said. And what happened to you? The fact that we were used as opposing pieces in someone else's plan. I want you to know I'm aware that you had no part in constructing this situation, that you were brought into it the same way Owen was, under false pretenses, with no information. She studied the side of his face. I know that. I know you know it, he said again. I'm saying it anyway because some things need to be said out loud, not for information, for the record. She didn't answer immediately. She turned back to the window. The rain was intensifying slightly, the droplets on the glass running together in small tributaries, and she watched them and felt the strangeness of this man beside her, this strange and enormous and non-optional situation they were both inside, and the way it had somehow produced these small, careful moments of honesty that she hadn't expected and didn't entirely know what to do with. Don't get me killed tomorrow, she said. He turned to look at her. That's not in the plan. I know, say it anyway. A beat. I won't let anything happen to you. She nodded once, to the glass. Okay, she said. Good night. He left. She stayed at the window a while longer, listening to the rain. Oh, the gala was everything a gala was, crystalline and expensive and built for the performance of generosity, 600 people in formal clothes in a ballroom with chandeliers that threw light in every direction, the ambient sound of a string quartet and the specific quality of conversation that happened between people who were networking while pretending not to. The Whitmore Foundation's charitable work, educational programs, urban development initiatives, was present in the branded materials and the speeches and almost nowhere else. What was present was money and connection and the careful choreography of influence. Elena arrived with Lucien at 8:15. She wore a deep navy gown and her hair up, and the particular set of shoulders she had learned in 3 weeks of living in this world. Not rigid, not soft, the specific composure of a woman who belonged in this room and was not trying to convince anyone of it. Lucien's hand was at the small of her back as they entered, light and formal, the geometry of a couple. She felt it and kept her breathing even. The first 40 minutes were mechanics. Introductions, circulation, the practiced social movement of people who knew what they were there to do. She watched the room over the rim of her glass, cataloging. Hargrove was near the north side, as predicted. Tall, silver-haired, the polished ease of a man who had spent decades in rooms exactly like this one. His security, 2 men in black tie who were not quite convincing as guests, flanked him at a professional distance. The portable drive, hardware encrypted, biometric, would be in his interior jacket pocket, per Rice's intelligence. Lucien was across the room talking to someone from the city's planning commission, which was real enough. His legitimate business holdings required these relationships. But she could feel his attention distributed the way she'd learned to recognize it, the fraction of his awareness that was always tracking her position in the room. She found Graham at 8:56. He found her, technically. She had positioned herself near the eastern bar, alone for a moment, Petra visible 20 feet away in conversation with 2 women Elena didn't recognize. She had her back half turned to the room, which was the correct angle, while visible enough to be seen, occupied enough to suggest she wasn't seeking. Elena. His voice was exactly as she remembered. Warm, a little surprised, expertly modulated. She turned, and there he was. Graham Mercer in a charcoal tuxedo, a glass of champagne in one hand, the smile she had once believed was the real thing. She let something happen in her face. Surprise. A complicated flash of feeling that she made look like confusion and unexpected relief. Graham! Her voice came out with the right texture. Guarded but not hostile, the sound of a woman who was off balance and trying not to show it. I didn't know you'd be here. I could say the same. He stepped closer. His eyes moved over her, assessing, and she watched the assessment behind the warmth and noted it and showed him nothing of the noting. You look. How are you? I've heard things. I imagine you have. Elena. He lowered his voice. Not dramatically. He was too skilled for drama. Just intimate, the register of concern. Talk to me. What's happening with you? People are saying you married Lucien Morelli. Yes. He waited. He was good at waiting. It's complicated, she said. She let the word carry weight. Let it suggest things she wasn't saying. She watched him hear those things and file them. I've been worried about you, he said. After everything with Owen, I heard about the arrest. I tried to reach you. My number changed. I know, I understood. He touched her elbow briefly, lightly. The gesture of an old friend, practiced and warm. Can we find somewhere quieter, just to talk? This was the correct development. She had been told it would happen this way. She had prepared for it. What she had not prepared for, and what she recognized now with a kind of cold precision, was how unchanged he was. How entirely the warmth held up, how well he wore the face of someone who simply cared. 14 months of this face. She had been held and comforted and encouraged by a performance, and the performance was flawless, and she had to stand here and receive it and give him something back. 5 minutes, she said. I can't leave the room long. He nodded, understanding and solicitous, and guided her toward the corridor along the south wall. Not the service corridor, the guest corridor, a quieter space with marble floors and low lighting that hosted small conversations throughout the evening. She went with him. Petra clocked her direction and adjusted position. In the corridor, he turned to her, and the warmth went slightly more serious, which was still the performance, but a deeper layer of it. Tell me what's going on, he said. You don't have to protect me from it. She let her hands move, a small, slightly lost gesture, the body language of someone trying to find solid ground. It happened so fast. Owen was arrested, and then these people came, and the terms they offered. She paused. Let it sit. I signed something I shouldn't have. I didn't have a choice. You always have a choice. She looked at him. Easy to say. Elena. He moved slightly closer. I know this world. I know how these organizations operate. If you're in a situation where you're not free to leave, I'm not a prisoner. That's not how it looks from outside. She let the silence breathe, let him feel like he was handling it correctly. What does it look like from outside? She said, quiet. Like someone took advantage of a crisis to get access to you. His voice was steady, measured. And I want to know, is there anything you've seen or heard that's concerned you? Anything about the operation, the finances? There it was, clean and fast, the pivot from concern to purpose. She recognized it the way you recognize a card trick on the second watch. The mechanics visible, the sleight of hand no longer hidden. She let the moment hang for 2 seconds. Then she said, Actually, yes, there is something. His eyes focused. Fractionally, barely, but she was watching for it. What is it? There's documentation, she said. I don't know what it means exactly. Financial records. I saw them in a folder that was left out. Account numbers. A name I didn't recognize, but the numbers were large. She shook her head slightly, plain uncertainty. I don't know if it's relevant. Can you get to it again? She looked at him. Let the hesitation be visible. Maybe. I'm not sure. He put his hand over hers on the marble side table. The gesture was warm and careful and completely deliberate, and she did not pull away. Whatever you've gotten into here, he said, I want to help you get out. That's all. But I need to know what you know. She was about to answer, feeding him the next piece of the construction, when her earpiece, nearly invisible, hair-thin wire, disappearing behind her ear, produced a sound she had been told was the abort signal. One long tone. She kept her face absolutely still. The abort signal meant the operation was compromised. Hargrove had been warned, or the drive had been moved, or someone had made them. It meant, get to the service corridor, do not execute the secondary step, Extraction in 4 minutes. "Excuse me," she said to Graham. She let something flicker in her face. Distraction. The look of someone who'd heard something at a distance. "I need to get back. Lucien will—" "Of course," Graham said, smooth as water. His hand released hers. "Think about what I said. I'll be here all evening." She moved back into the ballroom. Her face was composed. Her heart rate was doing something she was ignoring. She crossed the room with the measured pace of someone going toward a drink, not away from a problem, and when she was close enough to the service corridor's entrance, she turned into it naturally, a woman looking for a quieter space, and the door swung shut behind her. Petra was already there. "What happened?" Elena said. Petra's expression was tight in a way Elena had never seen before. "There's been a breach. Inside the building. Not the gala. Upstairs." Elena stared at her. "Upstairs." "The 14th floor. Someone accessed Rice's workstation in the last 30 minutes. The financial documentation, the evidence we've been building, the server map, the Kessler-Vance file architecture. Someone pulled it. The floor did something under Elena's feet that wasn't physical. Pulled it. Copied and transmitted. We don't know where yet." Petra looked at her directly. "And Rice is not responding to his comm." Elena stood in the service corridor with the noise of the gala muffled behind the door and felt the shape of what had just happened rearrange itself in front of her. The abort hadn't been about Hargrove being warned. The abort had been because the operation had been gutted from the inside. The evidence database, the documentation that was supposed to dismantle the case against Owen, accessed and stolen by someone who had been on the 14th floor tonight with clearance to be there. "Who was up there?" she said. "Rice, 2 security personnel, and—" Petra stopped. "Who?" Elena said. Petra's jaw tightened by a fraction. "Dwyer." Elena's mind went very still and very fast simultaneously, the way it went when she was reading a structural calculation that didn't add up. All the pieces rearranging themselves, the weight redistribution happening in real time, the terrible math becoming clear. Dwyer, who had swept her room the night of the shooting, who had been on every security team, every debrief, every operational planning session for 3 weeks, who had known the route of the car when Tomas drove her to the site visit, who had known which window was hers on the 12th floor. "Find Lucien," she said. "He's already been contacted." "Find him now, Chet." Lucien was in the ballroom's eastern anteroom when she reached him, a small staging space used for catering, empty of staff at this hour. The sounds of the gala a low pressure behind the walls. He was on a phone call that he ended when she came through the door. His face was the most unguarded she had ever seen it, which meant it was still mostly guarded, but the edges had slipped. "Dwyer," she said, "we don't have confirmation yet." Petra said he's not responding, and the breach originated from his access terminal, Lucien said. "That's not yet confirmation?" But his voice had something in it that was not quite the steadiness she'd come to rely on. A compression, deeper than usual, the kind that meant the steadiness was being produced rather than simply existing. "The documentation is gone," she said, "backed up in 2 additional locations." She exhaled. Okay, so the backup... One of those locations was a physical drive held by Rice, he paused. "We haven't reached Rice." The silence that followed was the specific silence of a plan coming apart at multiple points simultaneously. Elena stood in the catering anteroom in her navy dress and felt the weight of it. 12 months of documentation, the evidence that could dismantle the case against Owen, the financial architecture that proved the conspiracy. If the primary copy had been transmitted to Danton's people, and if the physical backup was with Rice, who wasn't responding. "The 3rd location," she said, "encrypted cloud server, independent. They can't access it without a decryption key that exists in 2 parts. He met her eyes. "One part is held by my legal team's external counsel, and the other part is here." He reached into his jacket. He was reaching for something that wasn't there. She watched his hand stop, watched his expression do something for the first time that looked genuinely close to shock. Not theatrical, not performed, the real thing, the involuntary response of a person whose body has outpaced their comprehension. He went very still. "It's gone," he said. Quiet. flat. Elena felt the room tilt. When did you last? An hour ago, before we came in. An hour. The gala had been running an hour. He had come in with the drive, and at some point in the last 60 minutes, in a room full of 600 people, someone had removed it from his inside pocket. She thought about the corridor, the easy social circulation, the number of times in the first 40 minutes she had been slightly away from him, the number of hands he had shaken, the density of the crowd. A professional pickpocket in formal wear was invisible in a room like this. Graham. The name surfaced immediately, reflexively. But Graham had been with her, which meant Graham had been her purpose. While she kept Graham occupied in the south corridor, someone else had been positioned near Lucien. The operation hadn't been compromised. The operation had been inverted. They had been running a play tonight, and someone had been running a counterplay, and the counterplay had been designed to run simultaneously, 2 hands on the table while the third one was already in the pocket. They knew, Elena said. They knew exactly what we were planning to do tonight. The gala, the Hargrove approach, the drive. She looked at Lucien. They knew because someone told them, before tonight. Lucien's expression had settled back into control, but it was the kind of control that looked like it cost something now. Dwyer was on every operational briefing for 3 weeks, he said. How long has he been with you? 4 years. And before that? He was quiet for a moment that was too long. His prior employer was a private security firm based in Carlisle. We vetted the history. What was the name of the firm? He looked at her. She watched him access the information and watched him arrive at the same place she was already standing. Meridian Group, he said. She didn't know the name. She looked at his face, and his face told her the name meant something she was about to understand and not like. Tell me. Meridian Group was acquired 18 months ago, Lucien said, by a holding company in the Danton Capital Network. The room was very quiet. Elena stood inside the architecture of the thing, the full scope of it finally visible, every wall and load-bearing point exposed. Dwyer hadn't been recruited recently. Dwyer had been placed. 4 years ago, before any of this had started, someone had put an asset inside Lucien's organization and waited for the moment when the asset would be worth using, the patience of that. The scope of planning that required. This wasn't a reactive conspiracy. This was a structure that had been under construction for years. And she had walked into it the same night Owen had. Different door, same building. She sat down on the edge of a catering table, which was not a thing she did, but her legs had made a decision without consulting her. They have the documentation, she said. The copy that proves Owen was framed. They have it. And they have the decryption key, which means the cloud backup is inaccessible. And the physical backup is with Rice, who isn't. We will find Rice, Lucien said. And there was something in his voice now that was not calm, exactly, but was the thing that lived immediately adjacent to calm, the specific quality of someone who has not broken and will not break, and knows the difference between a disaster and a defeat. If they release that documentation before we can counter it, they won't release it. Not yet. He moved to stand near her, not crowding, not performing comfort, just present, the way he'd been present at the window the night before. If they release the manufactured evidence now, it becomes part of a federal record and it's out of their control. They keep it in reserve for leverage. That's been the play from the beginning, not to destroy Owen, but to own the threat of destroying Owen. It keeps you compliant and it keeps me exposed. She looked up at him. How long does that buy us? Long enough to find Rice, long enough to reconstruct what we can. He paused. But the gala approach is burned. Hargrove knows we were trying to reach him. He'll move the drive. So we have no path to the physical evidence, not the path we planned. She looked at him steadily. Then we need a different path. He was quiet for a moment. There is one. The way he said it, measured, exact, and with the specific quality of something being said that a person has been deciding whether to say, made her understand before he continued that the thing he was about to tell her was the thing he had been not telling her, and that it was going to change the shape of everything again. Graham Mercer, Lucien said, is not the architect of this operation. She stared at him. He is what I told you he was. A recruiter, an intelligence asset, a mechanism. He He was used to reach Owen and to reach you. He held her gaze. But the person who designed the overall structure, who identified both of you as targets, who built the Kessler-Vance approach, who placed Dwyer 4 years ago and has been running this as a long-term operation against my organization. He paused. It's not Danton Capital. The silence stretched. Then who? Elena said. Lucien's expression did the thing it almost never did. It showed her something. Not the controlled assessment, not the managed neutrality. Something underneath those briefly exposed, the look of a man who has arrived at a truth he did not want to arrive at. 17 years ago, he said, my father had a business partner, a man who built the early financial infrastructure of this organization before a dispute about the organization's direction ended the partnership. The separation was not clean. He paused. The man's name is Victor Hale. He has been working for a decade on what he describes, according to intercepted communications, as reclamation. Not profit, not expansion, reclamation. Elena felt something cold move through her. He wants the organization. He wants to dismantle what my father built and take what remains. And he has been patient enough to spend 4 years planting an asset, 8 months constructing a federal case, and 14 months running a relationship through Graham Mercer to position you here. He looked at her. You were never meant to be leverage against Owen, Elena. Owen was leverage to get you inside this building. You were the target from the beginning. The words landed. She sat with them. She ran the logic, the way she ran load calculations, checking each connection, each load-bearing point. The timeline. The purpose. Graham cultivating her, then creating the crisis with Owen, then the forced marriage. The shot through her window, the grab in the street, the access she'd been given to operational planning, to briefings, to the 14th floor. The things she'd heard and seen and been told. They wanted me inside your organization, she said slowly, as a genuine insider, not a planted operative, say something more convincing. A frightened woman who was given real access because you trusted the terms of the contract, a woman who could be extracted or flipped or used as testimony against you. She looked at him. And the gala tonight was supposed to be the extraction point. Graham gets close, I'm afraid, and isolated. The drive in your pocket is gone. The documentation is in Danton's hands. And I have enough information to damage you whether I intended it or not. Yes, Lucien said. And if I'd gone with Graham in that corridor, you wouldn't have come back to this building tonight. The sentence was very simple, and it meant exactly what it said. She sat with the full, unobstructed weight of it. The length of the planning, the number of people involved, the particular cold intelligence of using her love for her brother as the door and her own instinct for loyalty as the mechanism. Someone had looked at Elena Ashcroft, at everything she was and everything she cared about, and built a trap that fit her exactly. She stood up from the catering table. Her hands were steady. She was not trembling, not because she wasn't feeling anything, but because everything she was feeling had been compressed into something dense and functional, the way enormous pressure produces a thing that is small and nearly indestructible. She had a brother sitting in a safe house somewhere in this city who did not know that the case against him had just been weaponized again. She had a marriage contract that had been manufactured as a mechanism. She had a building full of people, some of whom had just betrayed the man she was standing next to, and a gala still in progress 40 feet away, and a man named Victor Hale who had spent 17 years building toward this night and believed at this moment that the night had gone according to plan. She looked at Lucien. Tell me about Victor Hale, she said. Tell me everything. Where he operates, how he moves, what he protects. She held his eyes. Because we're not waiting for him to make the next move. We're going to him. Lucien studied her face. The ballroom noise filtered through the walls. The string quartet playing something slow. The ambient weight of 600 people in formal clothes who did not know that the world immediately adjacent to their party had just rearranged itself around a 17-year grudge, and a woman who had run out of patience for being a piece on someone else's board. There's a meeting, Lucien said, in 72 hours. Hale's people, Hargrove, and the federal contact they've been using to sustain the case against Owen. A final coordination before they move to the next phase. He paused. I know where it is. Then we move first, Elena said. She could feel, somewhere in the marrow of the decision, that she was stepping past a threshold she was not going to be able to step back over. The woman who had signed a contract to save her brother, the woman who had believed she was managing a crisis, navigating a nightmare, keeping her head down until it was over. That woman was not the one standing in this anteroom right now. The one standing here had just understood that survival required something the previous version of her had not been built for. Not endurance, not management, not careful navigation. Something harder. She straightened her shoulders and looked at the door back to the ballroom, and the noise of the gala came through it like the sound of a world that did not yet know it was already over. And she said, "Show me the meeting location." And her voice was completely, absolutely, terrifyingly calm. 72 hours. That was the number. Elena wrote it on a piece of paper in the anteroom while the gala continued its oblivious rotation 40 feet away, then folded the paper and put it in her clutch because writing things down made them real, and real things could be planned against. Lucien was on his phone. Petra had materialized from somewhere and was standing near the door with the specific quality of readiness that meant she had already shifted from event security to something with sharper edges. The string quartet was playing something with too much sweetness in it, and Elena could hear it through the wall and found it almost offensive, the normalcy of it, the beautiful indifference. They left the gala at 9:40. Not running, not conspicuous. Lucien's hand at her back again, the composed exit of a couple concluding an evening. She smiled at two people she recognized from the guest list, let her eyes pass over Graham Mercer without expression. He was near the bar on the north side, watching her leave with a face arranged into casual indifference that she could now read like a document, and walked out into the cool night air and got into the car. Nobody spoke until they were 3 blocks from the venue. Then Lucien said, "Rice is alive." She turned to look at him. Dwyer locked him in the secondary server room on the 13th floor before he transmitted the files. He's been there approximately 2 hours. Callahan's team found him 8 minutes ago. He paused. He has a concussion and a broken finger. He didn't give up the physical drive voluntarily. Elena absorbed this. The anger came through clean and fast. The drive. Dwyer took it. So Dwyer has the physical backup, and they have the primary copy, and the cloud server, inaccessible without the decryption key, which they now hold half of. He looked at her steadily. We still have the external counsel's half. The server cannot be accessed or destroyed without both halves simultaneously. So it's a standoff. They can't use the cloud backup to confirm their version without our cooperation. Correct. Which means the manufactured evidence stays in a holding pattern, useful as leverage, unusable as a weapon unless they can compel our half of the key. She understood the geometry of it. The standoff bought time. Not much, and not without cost, but time. 72 hours, she said. The meeting location is a private facility in the Caldwell district, former industrial building, converted to office and private event use 6 years ago. Legitimate face. The sub-level floors are not on the public record. He looked out the window. Victor Hale owns the holding company that manages the property. He's been using it for coordination meetings for 3 years. How do you know that? Because Dwyer's access to that information is exactly why he was placed inside my organization. He reported the location to Hale's network 2 months ago. We intercepted the communication. He paused. We were waiting for the right moment to use the location against them. Tonight accelerated that timeline. She stared at him. You've known about the meeting location for 2 months. Yes. And you didn't act on it. Moving too early would have destroyed the legal case we were building. Hale needed to be in a position where his direct involvement was documented and provable. The gala was supposed to produce that. Hargrove's presence, the drive acquisition, the financial records as evidence of coordination, proof of conspiracy, not just financial fraud. She looked at his profile in the moving dark. And now we've lost the evidence that proves it. We've lost the copies we controlled. The evidence still exists, Pitch. It's in Hale's possession, which means it can be recovered. He turned to look at her, but not with the approach we planned. The car moved through the city, and Elena thought about the 72-hour window, about what it contained and what it required. She thought about Victor Hale and 17 years of patience and an organization built on reclamation. and she thought about Owen in his safe house, and about the version of the plan that had been designed for a world where Dwyer was trustworthy, and Graham was the full picture, and the gala went as choreographed. That world was gone. "What do we have?" she said. "Right now, what's left?" Lucien was quiet for a moment. Petra and 4 operatives who weren't in Dwyer's loop. Callahan and the legal team. Rice, when he's medically stable. The cloud server, inaccessible but intact, and the intercepted communications that placed Hale at the center of the coordination. Is the intercepted communication admissible? With the right federal contact, yes. We have a relationship with an assistant U.S. attorney named Voss, who has been working a parallel financial fraud case. She's been aware of the Kessler-Vance situation at a distance. She doesn't have enough to act on yet. What does she need? Direct evidence of Hale's coordination, a recording, documentation, a witness with first-hand knowledge. Elena looked at him. He looked back at her. The car pulled into the building's underground entrance and stopped, and neither of them moved for a moment. "I was in that anteroom tonight," she said, "with Graham. I'm the witness with first-hand knowledge of the recruitment operation. Your testimony establishes the conspiracy's intent. It doesn't give Voss the financial mechanism. But if we can get into that meeting in 72 hours, if we can document what happens in that room, it's not a walk-in," he said. "The facility has layered security. Hale will have his own people there, Hargrove's team, and now Dwyer, who knows exactly how we operate." She opened the car door. "Then we have 72 hours to build something they won't recognize," she said. "Let's go." They worked through the night. The conference room on the 14th floor became the kind of space that revealed its purpose after midnight. The overhead lights too bright, the coffee going stale in the pot. The map of the Caldwell District facility spread across the table with notes accumulating in 3 different handwriting styles. Petra ran the security assessment. Callahan worked the legal angle. What Voss needed, what was achievable, what a recording from inside that facility would require to be usable in a federal proceeding. Elena sat at the table and did what she did. She looked at the architecture. The facility's conversion plans were public record, filed with the city's building authority 6 years ago. She pulled them on Rice's secondary laptop, which Petra had retrieved from the 13th floor. Original industrial footprint, 6 stories above grade, 2 below. The sub-level floors had been listed in the conversion filing as storage, mechanical, utility. No specific interior layout, which meant whoever had built the space down there had done it without permits, which meant they had built it to not be found. But buildings had constraints that couldn't be hidden in filing documents: load-bearing structures, ventilation requirements, fire suppression systems that, by code, had to connect to the building's primary infrastructure. She followed the mechanical drawings for the legitimate floors and found where the connections branched in ways that the utility designation didn't explain. "There's a secondary ventilation shaft," she said at 2 in the morning. "It runs from the building's primary HVAC on the 4th floor down through both sublevels. It's listed as a return air duct, but the diameter is wrong for return air. It's a supply line, which means the sublevels are temperature controlled, which means they're occupied space, not storage." Petra leaned over the drawing. "Access point?" "Mechanical room on the 4th floor, here," Elena pointed. "The shaft drops straight down. If the sub-level meeting space is directly below, audio would travel," Petra said. Elena looked at her. "Yes." Callahan looked up from her laptop. "A recording obtained through a ventilation shaft in a building you don't have authorization to enter has chain of custody problems." "Unless we have authorization to enter," Lucien said. He was standing near the window, the city behind him going from deep night toward the barely perceptible pre-dawn gray. "The building has a legitimate commercial tenant on floors 1 through 3, an architecture and design firm." Elena stopped. He looked at her. "One of our holding companies owns a minority stake in the building's management entity. The commercial tenant, Aldgate Design Group, has been looking at a potential lease renegotiation." He paused. "If a representative of an interested architectural consultancy requested access to the building's structural systems as part of a facilities assessment, that's me," Elena said. "That would be you." She sat with it. The logic was clean, the risk was considerable, And the alternative was a 72-hour clock running down toward Hale's network, making their next move with no counter in place. She thought about Rice in a locked room with a broken finger. She thought about the drive in Dwyer's hands. "Set it up," she said. "Chum." The meeting was scheduled for a Thursday evening at 7. They had confirmation from the intercepted communications. Callahan had worked with Voss's office over 48 hours of careful back-channel preparation, enough to establish the legal framework for what they were about to do without giving Voss enough specific information to pull the operation out from under them. It was a needle Elena didn't fully understand how to thread and trusted Callahan to thread without her. She spent those 48 hours doing two things. She prepared the cover, pulling the Aldgate Design Group's public portfolio, familiarizing herself with the building's construction period, building a credible identity as an independent consultant. This was not difficult. She was an architect. She knew the vocabulary, the methodology, the way a professional moved through a building's mechanical systems with clipboard and camera. She had done it 100 times in buildings she was genuinely assessing. She also called Owen. This call was different from the previous ones. She didn't filter it. She sat in her suite on the 12th floor in the early morning of the second day and told him the full shape of what she now knew. Graham's role, Hale's operation, the gala, the missing documentation. She told it in sequence, without embellishment, the same way she used to tell him about structural problems on difficult projects. Here's the building. Here's the failure point. Here is what we are doing about it. Owen was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "How long have you known it was Graham?" "I suspected it earlier, confirmed it about a week ago." "And you didn't—" He stopped, restarted. "You didn't tell me." "I didn't want you carrying it before you needed to." "Elena." His voice did the thing it did when he was trying not to break and was losing the argument with himself. "That's not your call." "I know," she said. And she did know, and she hadn't known how to do it differently. And the fact that both of those things were true simultaneously was something she was going to need more time and more distance to sort through. "I know, Owen, I'm sorry." Another silence. "Is Morelli—" He seemed to search for the word. "Is he actually—" "Yes," she said. "He is." She wasn't sure which question he'd been asking. She answered the one she could. Thursday came the way significant days always came. Not differently, not with any atmospheric acknowledgement, just as another morning going gray to light over the city's rooftops. Elena dressed at 6 in clothes that read as professional without reading as formal. Dark trousers, a structured jacket, her hair pulled back. She looked, she thought, exactly like what the cover said she was. An architect doing a site assessment. She went over the building's mechanical drawings one last time with Petra, who was not going to be in the building with her, and whose expression communicated every professional objection she had to that particular fact. Lucien would not be in the building either. His presence anywhere near the Caldwell facility in the hours before the meeting would register with Hale's security if they were doing any kind of perimeter surveillance. He would be 3 blocks away in a car with Callahan and a direct line to Voss's office. "If anything moves wrong in there," Petra said, "you get out. You don't try to finish the recording. You don't try to locate the drive. You get to the exit on the west side and you get out." "I know." "Say it back." "If anything moves wrong, I get to the west exit and I get out." Petra studied her face for a moment with the assessing look of someone calculating odds they don't entirely like. Then she nodded once, and that was the end of the conversation. Elena picked up her sight bag. Clipboard, camera, measuring tools, a small audio device no larger than a pen, designed to record through building materials at a range of 12 meters, which Rice had produced from somewhere and calibrated despite the tape on 2 of his fingers. She walked out. The Caldwell district in the mid-afternoon looked like a neighborhood in transition. Older industrial buildings with new ground-floor restaurants, construction scaffolding on 2 corners, the specific urban texture of somewhere being reclassified. The target building was on Caldwell and 9th, 6 stories of reinforced concrete and steel frame construction circa 1962. The facade cleaned up for the commercial conversion, but still carrying the bones of its original purpose in every proportion. Elena walked past it once before going in, The way she walked past all buildings she was about to enter professionally, reading the exterior, the fenestration pattern, the mechanical equipment on the roof, the utility connections at grade level. She was not performing this. She needed to see the building before she was inside it. She went in at 2:15. The management office was on the first floor. A man named Terrence, facilities coordinator, had been prepped by the building management entity, Lucien's holding company connection, the lease renegotiation angle, and he walked her through the first and second floors with the genial efficiency of someone who had done this before and found it neither interesting nor suspicious. She asked the right questions. She took measurements she didn't need. She photographed ceiling heights and HVAC register placement and the locations of electrical panels, building a record that would look, to anyone reviewing it afterward, like a thorough and competent facilities assessment. On the fourth floor, Terrence took a call. He stepped into the corridor to take it. Elena was in the mechanical room, which he had unlocked for her, and she had her clipboard and her camera in approximately 4 minutes, which was what Petra's timing estimate had given her and what she was going to use. The HVAC unit was where the drawings had placed it. The secondary shaft branched off the primary supply trunk in the northeast corner. A large rectangular duct, gray metal, exactly the diameter she'd calculated. It dropped straight down into the floor, which had been constructed with a steel access panel for maintenance. The panel was not locked. She lifted it, looked down, and heard something that confirmed everything. Not machinery, not the ambient noise of a building's mechanical systems, but the specific, slightly reverberant silence of an enclosed, temperature-controlled, occupied space. She placed the recording device against the inner surface of the duct, pressing it to the metal with the adhesive backing Rice had prepared. It was magnetic as a secondary, which meant the duct wall itself would conduct vibration. She pressed it flat, checked it was flush, lowered the panel, and stood up. She was back at the mechanical unit with her clipboard when Terrence came back through the door, still talking into the phone, and waved at her apologetically. She waved back in the collegial way of professionals who understood that interruptions were part of the day. She left the building at 3:10. She sent one text to Petra. Done. Out. The hard part was the waiting. She was back in the building on Haverford by 4. Lucien was already there, which meant he had left his positioned car early, which meant something had changed. She found him on the 14th floor with Callahan and Rice, whose hand was bandaged and whose expression suggested that the concussion had reduced his tolerance for things being wrong. Dwyer made contact, Lucien said when she came through the door. She set her bag down. With who? With us. With me, specifically. He handed her a phone, his secondary line, a number only internal contacts held. She looked at the screen. A text message sent 40 minutes ago from an unregistered number. It's not what you think. I need to talk. Tonight. Alone. She looked up. He's scared, Petra said from the corner, which could mean he's genuinely trying to get out. Or it could mean Hale told him to make contact and create a distraction. Before the meeting, Elena said. Yes. She thought about the timing. The recording device in the duct would activate on vibration. It would capture whatever happened in the sub-level space from the moment voices began. But it was passive. It couldn't tell her who was in the room, couldn't adapt to the conversation, couldn't target specific exchanges. A distraction tonight, Lucien going to meet Dwyer, taking Petra, splitting the team, would reduce the monitoring and response capacity at the exact moment the meeting was happening. It's a diversion, she said. Possibly, Lucien said. You're not going. I haven't decided. She looked at him. If Hale has told Dwyer to draw you out tonight, going to that meeting puts you in a position where you are physically separated from the legal documentation we're trying to build and potentially in a location that Hale's people have chosen. That's not a risk that makes sense. Lucien held her gaze for a moment. Dwyer might have genuine information about what happens tonight, something we don't have. Or he might be the reason tonight fails. The room was quiet. Rice was looking at the ceiling. Callahan was watching Lucien with the expression of someone whose professional judgment was loudly not being asked for. Send someone else, Elena said. Not you, someone who can assess whether it's real without being the primary target. Lucien was quiet for 2 beats, then, Petra. Petra straightened. Where? Wherever he wants to meet, take Callahan's secondary investigator. Record everything. Petra nodded and was gone. The clock on the conference room wall read 4:57. 2 hours and 3 minutes until the meeting in the sublevel of the Caldwell building began, if the intercept timing was accurate. 2 hours and 3 minutes before the recording device in the duct either captured something usable or didn't. Elena looked at the building drawings still spread across the table. She looked at the route she had walked that afternoon, the mechanical room, the panel in the floor, the duct descending into a space she had heard but not seen. She thought about everything the recording would need to capture. Hale's direct voice, the coordination language, the reference to the manufactured documentation, the Kessler-Vance scheme in terms specific enough to be legally actionable. She thought about what it would miss. The drive, she said. Lucien looked at her. Dwyer has the physical backup drive. If Dwyer is at that meeting tonight, presenting what he took, handing it over as proof of delivery, the drive changes hands in that room. She looked at the drawings. And we have no way to intercept it through an audio recording. The silence in the room acquired a new texture. If the drive changes hands in that room, she continued, and Hale leaves with it, he has both the manufactured documentation and the physical backup that proves the documents were real and were approved by Owen's digital signature. He doesn't need the cloud server anymore. He has enough to hand to his federal contact and finalize the case. The recording from the duct gives us his coordination, Rice said. His voice was careful, the voice of someone thinking while they spoke. Conspiracy charges, federal exposure for Hale and Hargrove. But Owen is still named in the Kessler-Vance transfers, Elena said. The forged documentation still has his signature. Even if Hale goes down, the manufactured case exists. It takes years to unravel. Years. She looked at Lucien. The drive is the only thing that puts it away cleanly, the only evidence that shows the files were fabricated and the signature was forged. Lucien stood very still. I need to go back in, Elena said. No. The meeting is at 7. If I'm in the building before... Elena? His voice was the flattest she'd heard it. No. The west exit, she said. You told me. If anything moves wrong... I said that about an access and placement operation with a known timeline and a clear exit. I did not say it about you being inside an active meeting location when Hale's people arrive. I know the building. I walked every floor this afternoon. I know where the service stairs are. I know the west exit timing. I know the sub-level access points from the filing drawings, which Hale's security team has also seen. They've seen the official drawings, she said. I've seen the building. She held his gaze. There is a difference. He stared at her. His jaw was tight, the way it had been in the corridor at 4 in the morning when the window was broken, but different. Not the contained anger of someone managing an external threat, the specific look of someone managing an internal one, which was considerably harder. The drive is the evidence that saves Owen cleanly, she said. Everything else saves us and leaves him in ambiguity for years. You know that. The clock said 5:19. Lucien looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked away, toward the window, the city outside going orange and long in the late afternoon light. His hands, at his sides, were doing the thing she had learned to watch for, the specific stillness that meant everything was moving very fast on the inside. There is one access point, he said. Not to her. To the room, to the drawings, to the particular geometry of a decision already being made. The service corridor on the sublevel is accessible from the western utility stairwell. It's not on the official drawings because it was constructed as part of the unpermitted renovation. But we have the construction records. Reese pulled them 2 months ago. I know, Elena said. He turned to look at her. You knew. I found the inconsistency in the mechanical drawings this morning. The ventilation shaft placement implied a service corridor that the official layout didn't account for. I didn't bring it up because I wanted to finish the placement operation first, and this is the conversation it leads to, which I knew you were going to. Elena. She stopped. He crossed the room to stand in front of her, not crowding, not performing anything, close the way he had been at the window the night before the gala. Present, the specific warmth of someone who was in the same actual situation as you rather than managing you through it. He looked at her with an expression she had no clean name for, something that had been building in increments across the 30-some days they had been inside this thing together, something that didn't have room in a contract or an operational briefing, but was real and present and was choosing the absolute worst possible moment to be undeniable. "If something goes wrong in there," he said. His voice was different, not the measured delivery of operational assessment, the voice of a person saying a thing they mean. "There is no version of tonight that I'm willing to accept where something goes wrong with you in that building." She looked at him. Her heart was doing something complicated, and she told it to stand by. "I understand," she said, "but Owen." He held her eyes for 3 seconds that contained something she was going to need to look at later, when there was time and space and they weren't running toward a burning building. Then he stepped back. He turned to Rice. "Pull the construction records. I want the service corridor mapped in the next 20 minutes. He turned to Callahan. "Get Voss on the phone. She needs to know the timeline has moved up, and we need her people positioned for an evidence retrieval." He turned back to Elena. "You go in at 6:30. The meeting starts at 7. You have the service corridor and the west stairwell, and you do not go into that room under any circumstances. The drive changes hands. If it changes hands, and Dwyer makes a delivery, it will pass through the service corridor to the secure room on the sub-level second floor. You intercept it there, not in the meeting room." She nodded. "And Elena." He said her name the way he had the night before the gala, with intention. "At 6:55, regardless of what you have or don't have, you are at the west exit." She held his gaze. "I'll be at the west exit." She turned and picked up her sight bag and began checking its contents with the focused precision of someone who understood that every item in it now had a specific, non-negotiable purpose, and she did not look at him again because looking at him was a thing she had decided to defer, and deferring it required not starting. The clock said 5:27. 90 minutes. She thought about Owen. She thought about the drive and what was on it, and what it meant for him if she got it out of that building, and what it meant if she didn't. She thought about 17 years of patience and a man named Hale who had built a structure specifically designed to be inescapable, who had never once imagined that the woman he'd placed at the center of it would choose to walk back into the building that was supposed to be the end of her. She checked the recorder Rice had given her. She checked the small secondary device, a data duplicator capable of cloning the drive's contents in 40 seconds if she had access to it for 40 seconds. She checked the layout she had memorized, the west stairwell, the service corridor, the room. She put everything in the bag. She said, "I'm ready," to no one in particular, and walked toward the door, and the city outside the windows was going from amber to the specific bruised purple of the hour before dark, and somewhere in the Caldwell district a building was waiting with a room in its basement that held everything she needed to bring her brother home. The elevator came. She got in. The doors closed. Her hands were steady. Her heart was not, and she let it not be, because the heart knew something the hands were too busy to acknowledge, that this was the moment the person she had been for 31 years stepped aside for the person she had been becoming without knowing it, since the night a phone rang at 2:47 in the morning and a stranger's voice on the other end of the line had changed everything that came after. The lobby, the street. She walked north toward Caldwell into the darkening city and did not look back. The Caldwell building at 6:30 in the evening looked exactly the way it had at 2:15 in the afternoon, which was the first thing Elena checked as she came around the corner from the west side. The exterior, the roofline, the positions of the 2 vehicles parked on the north face that hadn't been there earlier and were now. Not delivery vehicles. Too clean, too positioned, angled for exit rather than loading. She clocked them and kept walking, the sight bag over her shoulder, her pace unhurried. The west utility entrance was a steel door recessed into the building's ground level, accessible from a short stairwell below grade, the kind of entrance that existed in every commercial building of this age, the one the cleaning crews used, the one that nobody looked at twice. The key code had been provided by the management entity, the same cover that had gotten her in that afternoon. Lucian's people had confirmed the code hadn't been changed. She went down the steps. The door opened. She was in. The utility corridor was concrete and fluorescent and smelled of old building, mineral dust, pipe joint compound, the specific cold of spaces that never saw sunlight. She moved through it with her flashlight low, following the route she had spent the last hour memorizing until it lived in her body rather than just her mind. Left at the first junction. The mechanical room access on the right, where the HVAC trunk ran. She paused long enough to confirm the recording device was still in place, the adhesive holding against the duct surface, the indicator light a dim and steady green that meant it was active. She kept moving. Down the utility stairwell, saw one flight, no lighting beyond her flashlight, the steps concrete and solid under her feet. The sublevel first floor was infrastructure, pipes, cable trays, the building's primary electrical distribution boards. She moved through it fast. The sublevel second floor was different. She understood, stepping through the fire door at the bottom of the stairwell, that whoever had built this space had not been cutting costs. The concrete had been finished. The lighting was indirect and warm, recessed into a dropped ceiling that had been installed over the original structural soffit. Doors with keypad locks, the kind of renovation that costs real money and leaves no public record. She checked her watch. 6:41, 19 minutes. The service corridor ran east-west along the building's northern edge. According to the construction records Rice had pulled, the secure room, the one used for storage of operational materials during coordination meetings, was the second door on the right. She moved to it. The keypad required a code she didn't have. She stood in the corridor for 3 seconds, looking at the keypad, feeling the 19 minutes compress. She had anticipated this. She reached into the sight bag for the bypass device, a small card reader Rice had modified, designed to cycle through the manufacturer's default sequences, which were never changed on locks installed in unpermitted spaces because unpermitted spaces didn't have facilities managers running security audits. She pressed it to the keypad's face. 12 seconds. The lock disengaged. She pushed the door open and went in. The room was the size of a large office. Metal shelving along 2 walls, a table in the center, a wall-mounted monitor that was off. On the table, a locked metal case the size of a hard-sided laptop bag, 2 file folders sealed with security tape, and a coffee cup that was still faintly warm. Someone had been in this room recently. She checked behind the door. She checked the corners. She was alone. She set down the sight bag and went to the metal case first because the case was the right size and weight for what she was looking for. The lock was a 4-digit combination she didn't have, and the bypass device worked on keypads, not mechanical locks. She looked at it for a moment, and then at the file folders. The file folders were sealed, but not locked. She broke the security tape on the first one with the controlled deliberateness of someone who understood that what they were doing was irreversible, and had already made that calculation. Inside, printed financial documentation, transfer records, Kessler-Vance routing numbers, Owen's digital signature on 43 approval forms. She recognized the documents. She had seen the structure of them in Rice's presentations, but these were the originals, or high-fidelity copies, the manufactured evidence that had been used to build the federal case against her brother. Someone had printed them for this meeting, for presentation. Her hands moved before her mind had fully caught up. She was already pulling the small document scanner from the sight bag, the one Rice had included and she'd hoped she wouldn't need, running it across each page with the efficient speed of someone who had practiced this motion for exactly this contingency. 12 pages. 22 seconds. The device stored the images internally. She broke the tape on the second folder. These documents were different. These were the construction records, the actual fabrication logs, the digital forensics showing the signature replication technique, the account structures used to build the shell companies, the evidence of how the forgery was done, the evidence that, in the right hands, dismantled the case completely. She scanned these too. 40 seconds. Her hands were steady. Her lungs were doing something careful, measured, the breathing of someone managing a very specific quality of adrenaline. She was replacing the second folder when she heard footsteps. Not from the corridor. From above. The ceiling. Voices muffled by the structural concrete, the specific pressure of multiple people moving into a space directly overhead. The meeting room was on the sub-level first floor, 1 flight up, and the voices were coming through the infrastructure the way all sound traveled in old buildings, imperfectly, in pieces, but unmistakably there. 6:53. The meeting had started early. She stood very still in the room and listened to the muffled pressure of voices above her and did the math. The recording device in the duct was active. It would capture whatever was happening in that room. She had the scanned documents. What she didn't have was the drive, the physical backup that Dwyer had taken, which should have come through this room if Rice's intelligence about the delivery route was right. The drive wasn't here. She looked at the metal case. She looked at the door. She thought about Lucien's voice. At 6:55, regardless of what you have or don't have, you are at the west exit. 2 minutes. She picked up the metal case. It had some weight to it, not just the case itself, but something inside, something solid and small. She turned it over. The combination lock was a standard 3-wheel mechanism. She set it on the table and looked at it with the focused attention she gave to structural problems that appeared insolvable until she found the load path they were hiding. She pressed the case's side. The metal was slightly warped near the hinge. Thermal expansion. The case had been stored somewhere with temperature variation. She pressed harder, and the warped panel flexed, and she felt, rather than saw, the internal tray shift by 2 millimeters. She repositioned her grip, pressed the bottom panel flat against the table, and rolled the combination wheels to the most common default, 0000. The lock held. She tried 9999. The lock disengaged. Inside the case, 3 drives. 2 standard external hard drives and one that was smaller, matte black, with a biometric sensor on its face that she recognized from Rice's description. Hargrove's drive, the hardware encrypted one they had failed to reach at the gala. She stared at it for a fraction of a second that felt much longer. Hargrove had brought the drive to the meeting. Of course he had. This was the delivery meeting, the moment of consolidation, when Hale's network brought together everything they'd collected. The drive from Hargrove, the physical backup from Dwyer, the scanned documents in the folders. All of it, assembled in this room for handoff, which meant they were all here, tonight, in this building. She took the biometric drive and both external drives from the case and placed them in the sight bag. She placed 3 equal-weight items from the bag's tool compartment, a metal calibration block, a spare battery pack, a heavy lens cap from the camera, into the case in their place. She closed the case. She rolled the combination back to a neutral sequence. She returned the case to the table where she'd found it. She replaced both folders. She picked up the sight bag. 6:58. She was at the door when it opened from the other side. The man who came through it was not someone she recognized. Large, dark jacket, the build and posture of someone whose function in rooms like this was physical rather than administrative. He stopped when he saw her. She stopped when she saw him. The corridor light was behind him, and she couldn't see his face clearly, but she could see his hand moving toward his side. She moved first. Not toward him. Sideways, pressing back against the wall beside the door, putting the door itself between them, and she shoved it hard and fast, and the door's edge caught him across the forearm as his hand was coming up, and she heard the impact and heard something drop. She was through the doorway and into the corridor in the same motion, moving west, and she heard him behind her, a controlled oath, footsteps starting, and she ran. Not panicked running, directed running, the building's layout vivid and spatial in her mind the way buildings always were, every junction and turn already plotted. Left at the first junction, the stairwell door. She hit it with her shoulder and it opened, and she was on the stairs, going up. Not down, up, because down was infrastructure and a dead end, and she needed the west exit, which was ground level, and the stairwell connected ground level at the 3rd flight. She heard the door below her open. She took the stairs 2 at a time. The ground level door hit the exterior stairwell, and the exterior stairwell hit the recessed entrance, and she was on the steps below grade. And then she was on the pavement, and the night air was cold, and she was breathing hard, and she kept moving, north along the building's western face, not looking back, the sight bag across her body, her feet finding the rhythm of someone who was leaving, not fleeing. The distinction mattered, she had decided, because it was true. Her phone was out. One text to Petra. West exit. Coming out now. She turned the corner onto Caldwell, and there was a car, dark and unmarked, engine running, and Petra was out of the passenger door before Elena had fully reached it and took one look at her face and said nothing, just put a hand briefly on her shoulder and guided her into the back seat. The car moved. Elena sat in the back seat and breathed. The sight bag was in her lap. Inside it, 3 drives, a document scanner containing 61 scanned pages, and a recording device still active in a duct 3 blocks behind her. She pressed the back of her head against the seat and looked at the car's ceiling and let her heartbeat do what it needed to do, which was run fast and hard and gradually, over the next 90 seconds, begin to slow. Set. Lucian was at the building on Haverford when they arrived. He was in the underground garage, which was not where he was supposed to be. He was supposed to be 3 blocks from the Caldwell facility until the extraction was confirmed. He was here instead, which she understood when she got out of the car, and he looked at her with an expression she had been deferring the right to see clearly, and she allowed herself to see it now. The specific quality of relief in a person who has spent an hour not knowing and is only now permitting themselves to know. He didn't say anything. He looked at her face, then at the sight bag, then at her face again. "I'm fine," she said. "I can see that. I have the drives." Something moved through his expression. All of them. Hargrove's biometric drive, both externals, and 61 pages of scanned documentation, the manufactured evidence and the fabrication records. She held his gaze. And the recorder in the duct was active. Whatever happened in that room is on the recording. He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "There's something you need to know." She waited. Petra reached Dwyer. She went still. "The meeting with him was real," Lucien said. "He did want out. He'd been placed inside the organization by Hale's network 4 years ago, which is what we believed, but what we didn't know was that he'd been trying to terminate the arrangement for 8 months. Hale's people had leverage on him. A sister in a situation they had engineered." He paused. "Dwyer took the physical drive tonight not to deliver it to Hale. He took it to prevent delivery." Elena stared at him. "He didn't come to the Caldwell meeting," Lucian continued. "He gave Petra the physical backup drive 2 hours ago, along with his own recorded testimony about Hale's operation, the Kessler-Vance scheme, and the placement of himself as an asset." He paused again. "He also gave her a name we didn't have, the federal contact Hale has been using to sustain the case against Owen. An assistant district attorney named Strand, who has been suppressing the exculpatory evidence that the FBI's own forensic accountants flagged 3 months ago." Elena absorbed this slowly and carefully, the way she absorbed information that required her to rebuild a structure she had already built. Dwyer had been working against Hale from inside. The breach she had run toward tonight, the theft, the betrayal, the disaster, had been, at least in part, a man trying to do the only thing he could do with the position he was trapped in. She didn't know how to feel about that. She suspected she wasn't going to know for a while. "Where is he now?" she said. "In federal protective custody. Callahan coordinated with Voss's office an hour ago. Strand is being reviewed as of tonight." He looked at her steadily. "Voss has the recording from the duct, the drives, the scanned documents, and Dwyer's testimony. She has enough." The sentence was simple and final, and Elena stood in the parking garage of the Haverford building and let it settle into her the way things settle that have been a long time coming. Not suddenly, not with drama, but with the slow and enormous weight of a structure finally achieving its balance. "Owen," she said, "Callahan is filing the motion tonight. With Strand's conflict identified and the exculpatory evidence restored to the record, the federal case collapses. It won't be instantaneous. Nothing legal is instantaneous, but the trajectory is clear." He held her eyes. "He comes home." She nodded. She was not going to cry in the parking garage. She had filed that decision 45 minutes ago, and she was maintaining it, though the filing was under considerable pressure. "Okay," she said. Her voice was steady. "Okay." She called Owen at 11:15 that night. He answered on the second ring, which meant he hadn't been sleeping, which meant Marcus had probably not been sleeping either, which meant the two of them had been sitting in Marcus's apartment doing exactly what Owen always did when he was frightened, keeping the lights on and talking until the thing that was frightening him had somewhere to go. She told him it was over. She said it simply, the same way she'd told him the shape of things 2 days ago. Here is the building. Here is what changed. Here is where it stands. The federal case. The evidence. The motion being filed. He was quiet through most of it, and she could hear his breathing, and at the end he said, "How long?" "Callahan says 4 to 6 weeks for the formal dismissal. It may move faster." A long silence. "And you're okay?" "Yes." Elena. He said her name with the full weight of knowing her, the 14 years since the accident, every version of her he had witnessed, including the ones she'd tried to keep from him. What did this cost you? She thought about the question honestly. She looked at the wall of her suite, still white, still clean, still saying nothing to her. And she thought about what the last 36 days had cost, and what they had made, and whether those two things were separable. I'm working on the accounting, she said. He made a sound that was almost a laugh. Almost. I love you, he said. I know. Go sleep. She ended the call and sat on the edge of the bed in the quiet of the building and let herself feel, for the first time in 5 weeks, something that wasn't crisis. It was not comfortable. It was large and complicated and had sharp edges in places she hadn't expected, and it was real in a way that the managed numbness of the past weeks had not been. She sat with it for a while. The weeks that followed moved the way aftermath always moved. Not neatly, not in a single clean direction, but in the accumulated small motions of a world reassembling itself around a set of facts that had changed. Voss's office moved quickly once it moved. Strand was suspended within 4 days of the Caldwell recordings reaching the U.S. Attorney's Office, the investigation into his conduct opening the door to a review of every case he had touched in the preceding 3 years. Hale's network began to fracture almost immediately. The nature of organizations built on leverage was that leverage worked in every direction, and once the external pressure came off, the internal architecture started to show its load problems. Hargrove was arrested 8 days after the gala, the charges layered and federal, the kind that moved slowly and then all at once. Graham Mercer surrendered to federal investigators on a Tuesday morning, which Elena learned from Callahan in a text message while she was eating breakfast. She read the text, set down her fork, and sat for a moment with the specific quality of a feeling she couldn't name precisely. Not satisfaction, not grief, not relief alone. Something compounded. The recognition that justice, when it arrived, looked smaller than the wound, and also that the smallness of it didn't make it not real. Victor Hale was arrested in the 9th day. He did not go quietly. There were details Elena received secondhand through Callahan about the operation and what it had required. But he went. 17 years of patient construction, and he went in the back of a federal vehicle on a gray morning in a city that continued around him without pausing. Elena was at her drafting table when Callahan sent the confirmation. She looked at the message. She looked at the elevation study she'd been working on, a residential project in the city's north end, a young couple's first home, modest scope and real care in the brief. She looked at both things for a moment. Then she picked up her pencil and went back to work. The formal dismissal of the federal case against Owen Ashcroft came on a Thursday, 28 days after the Caldwell building. Callahan called with the confirmation at 9 in the morning, and Elena sat at the conference table on the 14th floor, the room that had become, over 5 weeks, as familiar to her as any room she'd ever worked in, and listened to the legal language and said thank you and ended the call. Owen arrived at the Haverford building at noon. She met him in the lobby. He was thinner than he'd been. 33 days in a safe house did that. The specific attrition of waiting in a small space for a world to resolve itself. He looked at her, and she looked at him, and then he crossed the lobby, and she put her arms around him and held on, and he held on. And neither of them said anything for a long moment, because the things that needed to be said were the kind that words handled badly. He pulled back eventually, and looked at her face with the assessing attention of a brother who had spent a lifetime learning to read what she didn't say. "You're different," he said. "I've been told." He looked around the lobby, the clean lines of it, the quality of the space, the way it was put together with intention and money, and the kind of discretion that was its own statement. "Is this—" "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "And Morelli?" She looked at her brother. "It's complicated." "You said that about Graham once." "This is a different kind of complicated." Owen studied her. He had the expression he got when he was doing the math, when he was running the full calculation, not just the surface numbers but the underlying values that produced them. She had watched him do it since he was 14 years old at a kitchen table with a textbook, and she recognized it now, and she waited for it to finish. "Okay," he said finally. "Okay? I trust you." He said it simply, the way he said things that were simply true. That's been the only thing that's kept me from losing my mind for 5 weeks, that I trust you. So, he looked at the lobby again. Okay. She felt something move through her chest that was not going to be filed or managed or deferred. She let it be there. Let's get lunch, she said. Lucian found her that evening on the building's roof. She had discovered in the second week of her residence that the roof was accessible and unwatched and had a view of the harbor that the interior floors didn't have, the city's western water going copper and then pewter as the light changed, the kind of view that made the scale of things manageable. She came up here occasionally when she needed the specific quality of space that rooftops provided: height without exposure, open air with structure underneath. He came through the access door and saw her at the railing and stopped. She turned to look at him. He was in a dark jacket, hands in his pockets, the building behind him and the city behind that. And in the evening light, he looked like what he had always looked like: precise, self-contained, and underneath both of those things, something considerably more complicated and alive. He looked at her the way he had been looking at her for the past week, with the expression of a man who had something to say and had been deciding how long the moment required before he said it. He crossed the roof and stood beside her at the railing. Below them, the harbor moved with the tide. A cargo ship was making its way toward the outer channel, slow and massive, the kind of thing that looked impossible from a distance and was simply physics up close. Owen got the dismissal, he said. Yes. Callahan says his record is clean. Kessler Vance's HR team has been contacted. She told me. He was quiet for a moment. Below them, the city made its ambient sound. Not loud, just present. The low, continuous proof of a world in operation. I had the papers drawn up, he said. She turned to look at his profile. The dissolution documents, he said. The marriage contract's termination. I had Callahan prepare them. He paused. You fulfilled every obligation you agreed to. Owen is safe. The case is resolved. There's no legitimate reason for the contract to continue. She looked at him directly. He was looking at the harbor. The papers are on the conference table, he said. You can sign them whenever you're ready. There's no pressure on timing. She turned back to the railing. The cargo ship was smaller now, moving toward the harbor's mouth. She watched it and thought about the contract she had signed in this building 38 days ago, and the person who had signed it, and the distance between that person and the one standing at this railing. Why did you come up here to tell me? She said. He was quiet. You could have left the papers on the table. I would have found them. She kept her eyes on the harbor. You came up here. She heard him exhale. A controlled, careful sound, the sound of a man who had spent a lifetime managing himself in rooms that required it and was standing on a roof where the requirements were less clear. Because some things, he said, need to be said out loud. She turned to look at him. He turned to look at her. The evening light was doing something specific to the space between them. The particular clarity that came at this hour, when the softening of the light made everything both more visible and more exposed. The contract was made under duress, he said. On your side. You had no real choice. I've never been comfortable with that from the first day. He looked at her steadily. A person who stays because they have no other option is not someone who stays by choice. And a marriage that isn't chosen isn't... He stopped, started again, more carefully, the way he was careful when precision mattered more than ease. I won't ask you to remain in something that started the way this started. You deserve the chance to build whatever comes next from a position that's actually yours. She looked at him. She looked at his face. The precision and the control and the thing underneath both that had been visible in increments, in corridors at 4 a.m, and in cars going through the dark city and on a rooftop the night before the gala. When he'd said, I won't let anything happen to you in the voice he used when he meant it. She looked at all of it and let the full accounting run. She thought about who she had been 38 days ago, the architect with her cold coffee and her drafting table, the woman who had spent a decade managing a life around the edges of someone else's safety, efficient and capable and careful and alone in a way she had never fully named. She thought about what the weeks since had cost and what they had produced and the particular, unrepeatable way that some things only became visible under pressure. She thought about the word he hadn't said. She reached into her jacket pocket and produced the papers. Callahan had left them on the table that morning, which meant he had asked her to, which meant he had been carrying the decision to give her these papers for longer than this evening. She had picked them up when she came through the conference room. She had brought them up here with her, which she had not fully explained to herself until now. She looked at the papers. She looked at the harbor. She looked at him. Then she took the papers in both hands and tore them down the center. The halves separated cleanly. She tore them again. 4 pieces. The legal language fragmenting into smaller and smaller portions of itself. She released them over the railing and watched the harbor wind take them, small white pieces dispersing against the copper and pewter of the water below, gone before they were halfway down. Lucian watched her do this. He didn't move. She turned to face him. "I've had 5 weeks to watch you operate," she said. "I've watched you tell me the truth when it wasn't convenient. I've watched you give me information when it would have been easier to manage me. I've watched you lose people you trusted and not let it make you cruel." She held his eyes. "I've watched you stand in a corridor at 4 in the morning looking at a broken window and have something on your face you couldn't completely control." She paused. "I know what I saw." He looked at her. The evening light was going, the city beginning to produce its own illumination from below. "I know how this started," she said. "I know it was wrong. The terms, the absence of choice. I know all of that." She held his gaze. "But I know what grew inside it. And I'm not willing to leave it in pieces on the ground because the beginning was difficult." He was very still. Not the managed stillness she had learned to read, the one that cost something. A different kind. The stillness of a person who has stopped holding something back. "Elena," he said. "Don't manage this," she said. "Don't be careful. Just say what it is." He looked at her for a long moment. The city below them was going from evening to night, light by light, the harbor turning dark and the water holding the last of the sky's color. Then he stepped forward and put his hand against the side of her face, not gently, exactly, but carefully, the way you hold something that is real and irreplaceable. And she put her hand over his, and neither of them looked away. "It's you," he said. "That's what it is. It has been for a while." She breathed out. "Okay," she said. Same word Owen had used, the word that meant "I trust this," the word that meant yes. She didn't move away from his hand. He didn't move his hand away from her face. They stood at the railing of the building's roof, with the city going bright and living below them, and the harbor holding its dark water beyond that. And the story that had started in a room with a contract and an impossible choice had arrived somewhere entirely different, not through the absence of cost, but through it, on the other side of everything that had been paid. There were no contracts now, no terms, no bargains, no obligations that ran in one direction. Just 2 people on a roof, in the dark, beginning. Owen Ashcroft returned to work 14 days after the dismissal, to a position at a different firm, a smaller one, more careful in its processes, the kind of company that had hired him because his reputation, stripped of the accusation, was exactly what it had always been: thorough, honest, good. He called Elena on his first day. She was at a site visit and took the call standing in an unfinished kitchen in the North End, sawdust on her jacket, blueprints under her arm. He said the Thai restaurant near his new office was decent, but not as good as the old one. She told him she'd been the judge of that. He laughed. She laughed too, briefly, the way you laughed at things that had earned it. Victor Hale went to trial 8 months later. Hargrove and Graham Mercer took plea agreements in the 5th month. The detail Elena heard from Callahan in a brief and businesslike phone call, the same way she received all the remaining legal news. She didn't ask for more than Callahan provided. She had decided, somewhere in the weeks after the roof, that there was a difference between understanding what had been done to her and building her daily life around it. One was necessary. The other was a cage with no door. She didn't attend the trial. She spent that week finishing the residential project for the young couple in the North End. The first home, modest scope, real care. She submitted the final drawings on a Thursday and sat at her drafting table and looked at them for a while. The clean lines of a small structure designed to hold a life, and felt something she had been feeling more frequently and with less surprise. The particular satisfaction of a thing built well to last. She moved her drafting table to the 12th floor suite. She pushed it to the window that faced the courtyard, pulled the lamp from the corner, and arranged her pencils and her scale rules and the coffee she would forget to drink. And when Lucien came to find her that evening, he stood in the doorway and looked at the drafting table in the window and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "You moved in." "I was already living here." "You moved in differently." She looked at him over her shoulder. He had the expression she had come to know best, the one that lived underneath the precision, the one that only appeared when the room had no audience. "Yes," she said. "I did." He came into the room. He looked at the drafting table, the elevation studies, the pencil marks, the cold coffee. He looked at her. He looked at the city through the window, the ordinary, unspectacular city that had been the backdrop to everything, that was still there and would remain. "Are you happy?" he said. She considered the question seriously. She turned it over the way she turned structural problems, looking for the load paths, the places where the weight was actually held. She thought about Owen, and about the young couple's first home, and about rooftop conversations and corridors at 4 in the morning, and the particular quality of being known by someone who had no reason to perform for. She thought about the woman who had signed a contract 38 days, and now, several months, behind her, standing at a window telling a man she didn't trust that she'd sign. What that woman had understood about herself and what she hadn't. The distance between them, measured not in time but in everything that had been learned and lost and found in the crossing. "Yes," she said, and meant it, the way you meant things that had been earned, completely, without reservation, with full knowledge of the cost. The city outside the window went about its life. The drafting table held its drawings, the lamp threw its yellow light across the calculations. She picked up her pencil. She went back to work.